What if everything you thought you knew about ancient civilization was wrong? What if the most sophisticated Bronze Age society in Europe wasn't in Greece, wasn't in Egypt, wasn't anywhere near the Mediterranean at all, but hidden in the frozen reaches of Scandinavia, a place most historians dismissed as a primitive backwater? This is the story of a civilization so advanced, so wealthy, so technologically sophisticated, that when archaeologists first uncovered its remains, they refused to believe what they were seeing. They found bronze swords that outperformed anything made in the ancient world. They discovered trade networks spanning over 3,000 kilometers, connecting Baltic shores to Egyptian pharaohs. They unearthed astronomical instruments so precise that modern scientists needed computers to understand how they worked. And perhaps most shocking of all, they found evidence of a warrior elite so powerful, so organized, that they controlled more territory than many ancient empires, all without leaving a single written word behind. The emergence of the Nordic Bronze Age around 1700 BC didn't just mark a transformation in Northern European society, it marked the birth of something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that would reshape the cultural landscape of an entire continent for over a millennium, influence the development of Germanic peoples who would eventually topple Rome itself, and leave behind mysteries that archaeologists are still struggling to solve today. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. This civilization didn't emerge from nothing. It grew from foundations laid by cultures so ancient, so mysterious, that their very names send shivers down the spines of historians who study them. The battle-axe culture. The single grave culture. Names that sound like something from a horror film, but represent real peoples who walked these frozen lands thousands of years before the first pyramid was built in Egypt. The battle-axe culture dominated much of Scandinavia and northern Germany from approximately 2800 to 2300 BC, establishing social and territorial patterns that would prove absolutely crucial for everything that came after. These weren't primitive cave dwellers scraping out a miserable existence in the frozen north. These were sophisticated warriors who had developed an entire ethos centered around a single object: the ceremonial battle axe. Picture this weapon in your mind. Not a crude stone club, but a finely crafted instrument of death and power, polished to a mirror shine, balanced perfectly in the hand, serving simultaneously as a practical tool for splitting skulls and a symbol of masculine authority so potent that men were buried clutching these axes to their chests, taking them into whatever afterlife awaited. Archaeological evidence from settlements in Jutland, the peninsula that forms modern Denmark, reveals something that shocked researchers when they first discovered it. These battle-axe people maintained extensive trade networks that stretched hundreds of kilometers in every direction. They imported flint from specific quarries located in distant regions, selecting only the highest quality stone for their weapons. They distributed amber, that golden fossilized resin that would become the foundation of Nordic wealth, throughout Central Europe. Their burial practices already showed unmistakable signs of social differentiation, with some individuals interred alongside multiple axes, ceramic vessels, and ornamental items that screamed elevated status to anyone who saw them. This wasn't egalitarian tribal society. This was the beginning of something far more complex, far more hierarchical, far more powerful. But the battle-axe culture was only half the story. Running parallel to it, overlapping chronologically with its later phases, was another mysterious group that contributed equally important elements to the emerging Bronze Age framework. They called them the single grave culture, named for their distinctive burial practice of placing individuals in single graves beneath earthen mounds. And here's where things get really interesting. These single grave people demonstrated advanced understanding of metallurgy even before true bronze production began. Copper objects, including flat axes, daggers, and ornamental pins, appear in their graves dating to 2500 BC. That's 500 years before the Nordic Bronze Age officially started. That's contemporary with the construction of Stonehenge. That's when the Egyptian Old Kingdom was building its greatest pyramids. Think about what this means. While pharaohs were stacking stones in the desert, people in Scandinavia were already experimenting with metal technology, already developing the skills that would eventually produce some of the finest bronze work the ancient world ever saw. The metalwork knowledge had penetrated the region through trade connections extending southward into Central Europe and eastward toward the Carpathian Basin, those mineral-rich mountains that would supply raw materials for Nordic craftsmen for centuries to come. The foundations were being laid, the stage was being set, and nobody in the ancient world had any idea what was about to emerge from the frozen north. The geographic scope of what would become the Nordic Bronze Age encompassed a remarkably coherent cultural zone that defied everything scholars thought they knew about prehistoric societies. Despite its considerable extent, spanning thousands of square kilometers across multiple modern nations, this civilization maintained a cultural unity that seems almost impossible without writing, without centralized government, without any of the tools that supposedly made ancient empires possible. Modern Denmark formed the heartland of this civilization, and when you understand the geography, you understand why. The numerous islands and peninsula territories provided natural harbors and strategic positions for maritime trade. The fertile soils of Jutland and the Danish islands supported dense populations that could sustain the specialized craftsmen and warriors characteristic of Bronze Age society. This wasn't marginal territory clinging to survival at the edge of the habitable world. This was prime real estate, perfectly positioned to dominate trade routes connecting the Baltic Sea to the Atlantic Ocean and beyond. Southern Sweden, particularly the provinces of Scania, Halland, and Bohuslän, shared cultural and economic ties with Denmark across the narrow straits that separated them. Archaeological finds from sites like Kivik in Scania demonstrate that Swedish communities participated fully in the Bronze Age cultural complex, producing elaborate rock carvings and monumental burial sites that rivaled anything found anywhere in the Nordic region. The Kivik tomb, discovered in the 18th century, contained carved stone panels depicting ships, warriors, and ceremonial scenes so sophisticated that early scholars refused to believe they could have been created by prehistoric Scandinavians. They assumed the carvings must have been made by Mediterranean visitors, by Greeks or Phoenicians, who had somehow wandered into the frozen north. They were wrong. These were local products, created by local craftsmen, expressing local beliefs, and they were just the beginning. Southern Norway's coastal regions, stretching from the Oslo Fjord westward to Rogaland, represented the northern frontier of this Bronze Age world. The Norwegian communities faced unique challenges in adapting Bronze Age technologies and social structures to their more rugged terrain and harsher climate. The growing season was shorter. The agricultural land was scarcer. The winters were longer and more brutal. But these challenges didn't prevent Norwegian communities from participating fully in the Bronze Age cultural complex. Instead, they adapted, they innovated, they found their own path to prosperity. Their control of important sea routes and access to distinctive raw materials, including high-quality whetstones and soapstone, ensured their integration into the broader Nordic Bronze Age network. Settlements along the Norwegian coast developed specialized fishing and sealing economies that complemented the agricultural focus of their southern neighbors, creating an economic diversity that strengthened the entire system. Northern Germany's coastal regions, particularly Schleswig-Holstein and parts of Lower Saxony, formed the southern boundary of the Nordic Bronze Age cultural sphere. These territories served as crucial intermediaries between the Scandinavian communities and the more advanced bronze-working societies of Central Europe. German archaeological sites have yielded some of the earliest bronze objects found in the Nordic region, suggesting that technological innovations often entered Scandinavia through these southern gateways before spreading northward through established trade networks. This wasn't a one-way street, though. Nordic products, particularly amber and distinctive bronze types, flowed southward through the same channels, creating reciprocal relationships that benefited communities on both sides of the cultural boundary. But here's the question that haunted archaeologists for generations. How did they do it? How did a civilization in one of the most metal-poor regions on Earth become masters of bronze technology? Bronze, that revolutionary alloy of copper and tin, required access to ore deposits that were entirely absent from Scandinavia. Not a single copper mine, not a single tin deposit, nothing. The copper sources lay hundreds of kilometers to the south, in the alpine regions of Central Europe, the Carpathian Mountains, and the Iberian Peninsula. Tin, even rarer and more geographically restricted, came primarily from Cornwall in southwestern Britain, Brittany in northwestern France, and parts of Bohemia and Saxony. The logistics of maintaining supply chains across such vast distances demanded unprecedented levels of organization and cooperation among communities throughout Europe. And somehow, against all odds, the Nordic Bronze Age people pulled it off. The establishment of trade networks, capable of supplying the raw materials necessary for bronze production, represented perhaps the most remarkable achievement of these early Bronze Age communities. This wasn't simple barter, wasn't casual exchange between neighboring villages. This was sophisticated international commerce operating across distances that would challenge modern logistics companies. Archaeological evidence suggests that Nordic Bronze Age societies developed systems of exchange that went far beyond anything seen before in European prehistory. Standardized bronze objects, particularly the distinctive Nordic daggers and axes, appear in hoards and graves across the entire region, indicating coordinated production and distribution networks that maintained quality standards across thousands of kilometers. The famous Nebra sky disk, discovered in Saxony in 1999, demonstrates the complexity of these exchange systems and the high value placed on exotic materials. This bronze disc, decorated with gold inlays representing the sun, moon, and stars, incorporated gold that originated in Cornwall, over 1,500 kilometers away, and amber from the Baltic coast, hundreds of kilometers in the opposite direction. The disc itself was manufactured somewhere in Central Europe, but its materials came from the far corners of the Bronze Age world. This single object represents trade connections spanning half a continent, coordinated production involving multiple specialist craftsmen, and astronomical knowledge sophisticated enough to accurately represent celestial phenomena. And it's just one artifact among thousands that reveal the true scope of Nordic Bronze Age achievement. Amber played a particularly crucial role in these trade networks, serving as the Nordic region's primary export commodity and the foundation of its extraordinary wealth. The shores of the Baltic Sea, especially along the Danish and German coasts, provided virtually the entire European supply of this fossilized resin. Amber's beauty was undeniable, its golden translucence catching light in ways that seemed almost magical to ancient peoples. But amber was more than just pretty. Ancient peoples believed it possessed magical properties, that it could heal diseases, ward off evil spirits, protect travelers on dangerous journeys. These beliefs made amber one of the most sought-after materials in the ancient world, commanding prices that would seem absurd for fossilized tree sap. Nordic communities developed sophisticated techniques for working amber that maximized its value in international trade. Raw amber pieces were carefully sorted according to size, clarity, and color, with the finest specimens reserved for the most valuable finished products. craftsmen learned to heat amber to precise temperatures that made it malleable enough to shape without causing fractures or discoloration. The technique of amber inlay work, where small pieces of amber were fitted into bronze settings, created composite objects that combined the beauty of both materials while demonstrating the technical skill of their creators. These weren't crude trinkets. These were luxury goods worthy of kings and pharaohs. The amber trade networks that developed during the Nordic Bronze Age connected Scandinavia to markets throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world in ways that still astonish researchers today. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean Greece includes amber beads that originated in the Baltic region, indicating trade connections spanning over 2,000 kilometers. Chemical analysis can identify Baltic amber with certainty, distinguishing it from amber sources in other regions, and Baltic amber appears in contexts from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Black Sea. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom period depict foreign tribute bearers presenting amber objects to pharaonic courts, suggesting that Nordic amber reached even the most distant corners of the ancient world. The wealth generated by amber exports provided the economic foundation necessary to import the metals required for bronze production, creating a self-sustaining cycle of trade and technological development that would continue for over a millennium. The transformation of these trade networks from simple exchange relationships into complex economic systems required new forms of social organization that fundamentally altered Nordic society. Archaeological evidence from the early Bronze Age reveals the emergence of distinct social classes that had not existed during the preceding Neolithic period. The relatively egalitarian communities of the battle axe and single grave cultures gave way to hierarchical societies dominated by warrior elites who controlled access to bronze, trade routes, and military power. Burial practices provide the clearest window into these developing hierarchies. While earlier burials showed relatively modest differences in grave goods, early Bronze Age interments display dramatic disparities in wealth and status markers that would have been unthinkable just a few generations earlier. Elite burials from this period contain unprecedented quantities of bronze objects, including weapons, tools, ornaments, and vessels, that represent enormous investments of raw materials and skilled labor. The Borum Eshoj burial mounds in Denmark, dating to approximately 1400 BC, contain the remains of individuals dressed in elaborate woolen garments and accompanied by bronze swords, axes, belt plates, and jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship. The preservation of organic materials in these waterlogged burials reveals that elite individuals wore clothing made from fine textiles decorated with bronze ornaments and buttons, creating visual displays of wealth and status that would have been immediately recognizable to their contemporaries. These weren't subtle status markers. These were screaming declarations of power and privilege, designed to awe and intimidate anyone who saw them. The emergence of warrior chieftain classes represented a fundamental shift in Nordic social organization that would shape the region's development for centuries to come. These individuals combined military leadership with control over trade networks and bronze production, creating power bases that transcended traditional kinship-based authority structures. The bronze sword became the ultimate symbol of this new elite, requiring exceptional skill to manufacture and considerable wealth to acquire. Early Nordic swords, with their distinctive flanged hilts and carefully balanced blades, represented technological achievements that matched or exceeded contemporary weapons produced anywhere in Europe. Owning such a weapon marked a man as someone special, someone powerful, someone to be feared and respected. These warrior chieftains established their authority through a combination of military prowess, economic control, and ritual leadership that made them indispensable to their communities. They controlled access to bronze-working technology and raw materials, ensuring that weapons and high-status objects remained concentrated within their social circles. The distribution of bronze objects across the landscape reflects this centralized control, with major concentrations appearing around what were likely chiefly residences and ceremonial centers, while smaller settlements show much more limited access to metal goods. If you wanted bronze, you had to go through the chief. If you wanted protection, you had to serve the chief. If you wanted status, you had to please the chief. The system was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its effectiveness. The warrior ethos that characterized these elite groups extended beyond simple military function to encompass broader concepts of honor, loyalty, and social obligation that would echo through Germanic culture for millennia. Bronze Age rock art from sites throughout Scandinavia depicts armed warriors engaged in combat, ritual activities, and ceremonial processions. These images suggest that warfare had become ritualized and regulated according to specific codes of conduct that emphasized individual heroism and martial skill. The standardization of weapon types and fighting techniques across the entire Nordic region indicates that warrior culture had become sufficiently institutionalized to maintain consistent practices across vast geographic areas. This wasn't chaotic tribal warfare. This was organized, regulated, almost ceremonial combat between trained warriors following established rules. Religious and ceremonial activities provided another avenue through which elite groups consolidated their authority and legitimized their power. Bronze Age communities invested enormous resources in ritual objects and ceremonial sites that served to reinforce social hierarchies and group identity. The famous Trundholm Sun chariot, discovered in Denmark and dating to approximately 1400 BC, represents one of the most sophisticated Bronze Age ritual objects ever found anywhere in the world. This wheeled bronze sculpture, featuring a gold-plated disc representing the sun drawn by a bronze horse, demonstrates both the technical capabilities of Nordic craftsmen and the complex cosmological beliefs that justified elite authority. The sun chariot wasn't just beautiful, it was a statement of cosmic power, a claim that the chiefs who commissioned such objects had special relationships with the divine forces that governed the universe. The concentration of wealth and power within warrior chieftain classes created new forms of competition and conflict that shaped the development of Bronze Age society in ways both creative and destructive. Control over trade routes became a source of ongoing tension between different groups, leading to the construction of fortified settlements and the development of increasingly sophisticated military technologies. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Torsbjerg in Denmark reveals defensive earthworks and weapon deposits that suggest organized warfare had become a regular feature of Bronze Age life. The competitive pressures and accumulated wealth that characterized early Nordic Bronze Age society created the conditions necessary for remarkable technological advancement, as chiefs competed to acquire the finest weapons, the most impressive ornaments, the most skilled craftsmen. Competition drove innovation, innovation drove wealth, wealth drove more competition. The cycle fed on itself, pushing Nordic Bronze Age society to heights that would have seemed impossible just a few generations earlier. By 1500 BC, Nordic craftsmen had developed metalworking techniques that rivaled those found in the most advanced centers of European civilization. The transformation from simple copper working to sophisticated bronze production required not merely access to raw materials, but the development of entirely new manufacturing processes, specialized tools, and technical knowledge that took generations to perfect. The earliest bronze objects produced in the Nordic region showed clear evidence of foreign influence, with forms and decorative motifs borrowed directly from Central European prototypes. But Nordic craftsmen quickly began developing distinctive regional styles that reflected local aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. They weren't just copying, they were innovating, improving, creating something new. The evolution of bronze daggers provides a clear example of this technological progression and the rapid pace of Nordic innovation. Initial Nordic daggers closely resembled Unitis culture weapons from Bohemia and central Germany, featuring simple flat blades attached to organic handles with bronze rivets. Within 2 centuries, Nordic smiths had developed their own characteristic dagger types, including the distinctive flange-hilted varieties that became hallmarks of Scandinavian bronzeworking. These weren't minor modifications. These were fundamental redesigns that improved functionality, durability, and aesthetic appeal simultaneously. The Nordic craftsmen had learned from their teachers and then surpassed them. The mastery of lost wax casting represented perhaps the most significant technological breakthrough achieved by Nordic Bronze Age craftsmen, a technique so sophisticated that it would remain the gold standard for precision metalworking for thousands of years. This complex process required the creation of detailed wax models that were then encased in clay molds and heated until the wax melted away, leaving precise cavities into which molten bronze could be poured. The technique demanded exceptional skill in temperature control, alloy composition, and mold construction. A single mistake at any stage could ruin weeks of work and waste precious bronze that had traveled thousands of kilometers to reach the workshop. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites at Halunda in Sweden and Thai in Denmark reveals the sophisticated equipment used by Bronze Age smiths, including specialized furnaces capable of reaching temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius, bronze-tipped bellows for maintaining consistent airflow, and stone molds for producing standardized ingots and tool blanks. These weren't primitive operations scratching out crude implements. These were industrial facilities, staffed by trained specialists, producing goods to exacting standards for markets spanning half a continent. The lost wax process enabled Nordic craftsmen to produce objects of extraordinary complexity and artistic refinement that would have been impossible using simpler techniques. Bronze razors from the period display intricate spiral decorations that would have been impossible to achieve through simple hammering or engraving techniques. The famous bronze lures, or ceremonial horns, found throughout Denmark and southern Sweden, represent the absolute pinnacle of lost wax casting technology. These massive instruments, some measuring over 2 meters in length, required precise acoustic calculations to ensure proper tonal qualities. The largest lures contain over 10 kilograms of bronze and display decorative elements so fine that modern reproductions require advanced industrial techniques to replicate their quality. When archaeologists first discovered these instruments, they assumed they must be medieval forgeries. No prehistoric people could possibly have created objects of such sophistication. They were wrong. The lures were genuine, and they represented just a fraction of what Nordic Bronze Age craftsmen could achieve. Sheet metal working developed alongside casting techniques, allowing Nordic smiths to create large decorative objects and functional items that would have required prohibitive amounts of bronze if produced through solid casting. The technique involved hammering bronze ingots into thin sheets that could then be shaped over wooden or stone forms to create vessels, shield bosses, and ornamental plates. Archaeological finds from Voltoft in Denmark include bronze cauldrons with walls less than 2 millimeters thick, demonstrating the exceptional skill required to work bronze to such precise specifications without causing fractures or weak points. These cauldrons could hold dozens of liters of liquid while weighing a fraction of what solid cast equivalents would have weighed. The technique represented a revolution in bronze working efficiency that made large ceremonial objects economically feasible for the first time. The decorative spiral motifs that became characteristic of Nordic Bronze Age metalwork reflected both aesthetic preferences and technical capabilities in ways that reveal the sophisticated thinking of Bronze Age craftsmen. These designs served multiple functions beyond simple ornamentation. The raised spiral patterns strengthened thin bronze sheets by creating structural ridges that distributed stress more effectively across the metal surface. The spirals also provided textural elements that enhanced grip on weapons and tools, particularly important for bronze handles that could become slippery when wet with blood or sweat. Most significantly, the spiral motifs carried deep symbolic meaning within Nordic Bronze Age cosmology, representing concepts of cyclical time, solar movement, and the connection between earthly and divine realms. Every spiral was simultaneously functional, beautiful, and sacred. The consistency of spiral motifs across the entire Nordic Bronze Age cultural zone indicates sophisticated systems for transmitting technical knowledge and artistic traditions that operated across vast distances without writing or formal education systems. Craftsmen appear to have undergone formal apprenticeships that standardized both manufacturing techniques and decorative styles. Bronze objects from sites separated by hundreds of kilometers display remarkably similar construction methods and ornamental details, suggesting that master craftsmen traveled extensively to train apprentices and establish workshops in new locations. The distribution of distinctive tool types, particularly the specialized hammers and punches used for creating spiral decorations, supports this interpretation of organized knowledge transfer. This was a civilization that valued expertise, that invested in training, that maintained quality standards across generations and geographic boundaries. The economic importance of amber in sustaining Nordic Bronze Age technological developments cannot be overstated, and understanding amber means understanding the very foundation upon which this entire civilization was built. While bronze required expensive imported raw materials that had to travel thousands of kilometers through dangerous territories controlled by potentially hostile peoples, amber represented something far more valuable, a renewable resource that Nordic communities could harvest directly from their own coastlines, a gift from the sea that kept on giving, generation after generation, century after century. The shores of the Baltic Sea, especially along the Jutland Peninsula and the coast of Prussia, provided virtually the entire European supply of this fossilized resin. Amber formed millions of years ago when ancient pine forests covered northern Europe. Their sticky resin-trapping insects, plant material, and air bubbles before hardening into the golden stones that would become one of the ancient world's most precious commodities. The geological processes that created amber were unique to this region, and the storms that battered the Baltic coast regularly washed fresh supplies onto beaches where anyone could collect them. Beach walking after severe weather could yield substantial quantities of high-quality amber pieces, suitable for working into jewelry and decorative objects. This was wealth literally washing up on shore, free for the taking. But raw amber was just the beginning. Nordic communities developed sophisticated techniques for working amber that maximized its value in international trade, transforming rough beach stones into luxury goods worthy of kings and pharaohs. Raw amber pieces were carefully sorted according to size, clarity, and color, with the finest specimens reserved for the most valuable finished products. The sorting process itself required expertise, the ability to recognize quality that would only become apparent after hours of careful polishing. Craftsmen learned to heat amber to precise temperatures that made it malleable enough to shape without causing fractures or discoloration. Too hot, and the amber would crack or turn cloudy. Too cool, and it remained too brittle to work. The temperature window was narrow, and mastering it took years of practice. The technique of amber inlay work, where small pieces of amber were fitted into bronze settings, created composite objects that combined the beauty of both materials while demonstrating the technical skill of their creators. These weren't simple combinations. The amber had to be cut precisely to fit bronze frames. The bronze had to be crafted with recesses exactly matching the amber pieces, and the two materials had to be joined in ways that would survive handling, wearing, and the passage of centuries. The finest amber inlay work, from the Nordic Bronze Age rivals, anything produced by later civilizations, including the famous amber rooms of European palaces that would be created thousands of years later. The amber trade networks that developed during the Nordic Bronze Age connected Scandinavia to markets throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world in ways that still astonish researchers who study ancient commerce. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean Greece includes amber beads that originated in the Baltic region, indicating trade connections spanning over 2,000 kilometers through territories controlled by dozens of different peoples, speaking dozens of different languages. How did they do it? How did amber travel from Danish beaches to Greek palaces without getting lost, stolen, or destroyed along the way? The answer lies in the sophisticated systems of exchange that Nordic Bronze Age societies developed. Systems that went far beyond simple barter to include standardized values, trusted intermediaries, and established routes that remained stable for centuries. Chemical analysis can identify Baltic amber with certainty, distinguishing it from amber sources in Sicily, Romania, and other regions. This analysis has revealed Baltic amber in contexts from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Black Sea, from the frozen north to the burning deserts of Africa. The Amber Road, as historians call it, was one of the great trade routes of the ancient world, comparable in importance to the Silk Road that would later connect China to Rome. Egyptian tomb paintings from the New Kingdom period, roughly contemporary with the Nordic Bronze Age Golden Age, depict foreign tribute bearers presenting amber objects to pharaonic courts. The Egyptians called amber the tears of the sun god Ra, believing it had fallen from the sky as divine precipitation. They valued it for jewelry, for medicine, for magical protection against evil spirits, and they were willing to pay extraordinary prices to obtain it. The wealth generated by amber exports provided the economic foundation necessary to import the metals required for bronze production, creating a self-sustaining cycle of trade and technological development that would continue for over a millennium. But amber wasn't just an export commodity. It was also a material of profound spiritual significance within Nordic Bronze Age society itself. Amber appears in elite burials throughout Scandinavia, often in contexts that suggest ritual rather than purely decorative functions. Amber beads were placed in the mouths of the dead, perhaps to provide light in the darkness of the afterlife. Amber amulets were worn as protection against disease and misfortune. Amber was burned as incense in religious ceremonies, its distinctive pine scent filling sacred spaces with fragrance that connected worshippers to the ancient forests from which it came. The development of maritime technology represented another crucial element in the success of Nordic Bronze Age trade networks. And here too, the achievements of these northern peoples exceeded anything that scholars once thought possible for prehistoric societies. The transition from simple dugout canoes to sophisticated plank-built vessels enabled communities to transport heavy cargoes of bronze objects and amber across the Baltic Sea and along the Atlantic coast of Europe. Archaeological evidence from Hjortspring in Denmark, dating to the later Bronze Age, reveals advanced boat-building techniques that produced vessels capable of carrying substantial loads, while maintaining the speed and maneuverability necessary for both trade and warfare. Early Nordic Bronze Age boats evolved from Neolithic traditions of dugout canoe construction, but incorporated new techniques that dramatically improved their capabilities. The use of overlapping planks, secured with bronze rivets, and caulked with animal hair and tar, created hulls that were both watertight and flexible enough to handle rough seas. These clinker-built vessels could be constructed in much larger sizes than dugout canoes, with some examples reaching lengths of over 20 meters. The addition of removable masts and square-rigged sails enabled crews to take advantage of favorable winds while retaining the option of rowing when necessary. These weren't primitive rafts. These were sophisticated sailing vessels capable of ocean voyages that would challenge modern recreational sailors. Navigation techniques developed alongside improvements in vessel construction, allowing Nordic mariners to undertake increasingly ambitious voyages across open water, where land was invisible for days at a time. The consistent orientation of Bronze Age rock art ships suggests that navigators had developed reliable methods for determining direction and position at sea. Archaeological evidence indicates the use of sun compasses, simple devices that use shadow patterns to maintain consistent headings during daylight hours. Knowledge of seasonal star patterns, ocean currents, and bird migration routes provided additional navigational aids that enabled mariners to reach distant destinations with reasonable reliability. The famous rock carvings at Tanum in western Sweden provide detailed depictions of Bronze Age ships and maritime activities that reveal the central importance of seafaring in Nordic Bronze Age society. These images reveal vessels with distinctive prow and stern decorations, often featuring animal heads or geometric designs that may have served both decorative and practical functions. The ships depicted in Tanum carvings show crews of varying sizes, from small vessels operated by 2 or 3 individuals to large ships requiring dozens of rowers. The presence of weapons and shields in many ship carvings suggests that these vessels served military as well as commercial functions. The sea was a highway, a battlefield, and a sacred space all at once. The Trundholm Sun Chariot, discovered in a Danish bog in 1902, represents one of the most remarkable achievements of Nordic Bronze Age craftsmanship and provides crucial insights into the religious and cosmological beliefs that motivated such technological innovation. Dating to approximately 1400 BC, this bronze sculpture consists of a 6-wheeled cart drawn by a bronze horse supporting a large bronze disc decorated with spiral patterns and covered on one side with a thin layer of gold. The entire assembly weighs several kilograms, representing a substantial investment in both materials and skilled labor that could only have been commissioned by the wealthiest and most powerful members of Bronze Age society. The technical sophistication of the Trundholm chariot demonstrates the full range of bronze working techniques available to Nordic craftsmen at the height of their powers. The horse figure was created through lost wax casting with fine details, including individual hairs in the mane and decorative harness elements. The wheels were constructed using a combination of casting and sheet metal work, with bronze spokes fitted into cast bronze hubs and surrounded by thin bronze rims. The sun disk itself represents perhaps the most technically challenging element, requiring precise control of gold working techniques to create the thin foil overlay without wrinkles or gaps. The gold leaf is so thin that light passes through it, creating an ethereal glow that must have seemed magical to Bronze Age observers. The symbolic significance of the Trundholm chariot extends beyond its technical achievements to provide insights into Bronze Age cosmological beliefs that governed every aspect of life and death. The contrast between the gold-covered side of the disc and the plain bronze reverse suggests concepts of day and night, with the chariot representing the sun's daily journey across the sky. Bronze Age peoples believed that the sun was pulled across the heavens by a divine horse, disappearing into the western sea each evening and traveling through the underworld before emerging again in the east each morning. The Trundholm chariot was a physical representation of this cosmic journey, a sacred object that connected human worshippers to the divine forces that govern the universe. The spiral decorations that cover both sides of the disc reflect the same motifs found on contemporary bronze objects throughout the Nordic region, indicating shared symbolic systems that unified diverse communities under common religious and cultural frameworks. These spirals weren't random decorations. They represented the cyclical nature of time, the eternal return of seasons and years, the connection between past and future that gave meaning to human existence. Every spiral on every bronze object was a prayer, a meditation, a connection to cosmic forces that transcended individual human lives. The EGT Vedgirl burial, discovered in Denmark in 1921, provides complementary evidence of Nordic Bronze Age technological and artistic achievements, while offering an intimate glimpse into the life of a single individual who lived and died over 3,000 years ago. Dating to approximately 1370 BC, this remarkably preserved burial contained the remains of a young woman dressed in elaborate woolen clothing and accompanied by bronze ornaments of exceptional quality. The preservation conditions in the oak coffin burial allowed organic materials to survive that would normally have decayed within years, providing unprecedented insights into Bronze Age textile production and personal ornamentation. The bronze objects recovered from the EGT Ved burial demonstrate the full range of metalworking techniques available to Nordic craftsmen. A bronze belt plate features intricate spiral decorations created through a combination of casting and engraving, with details so fine that they require magnification to fully appreciate. Bronze arm rings show evidence of careful finishing work, with surfaces polished to mirror-like brilliance and edges smoothed to prevent damage to clothing or skin. A bronze awl, probably used for leatherworking, displays the functional excellence that characterized Nordic Bronze Age tools, with a sharp point that remains effective after over 3 millennia. The woolen textiles preserved in the EGTV burial reveal equally sophisticated production techniques that challenge assumptions about prehistoric textile capabilities. The woman's dress was constructed from fine woolen fabric, woven in complex patterns that required advanced loom technology and exceptional skill in thread preparation. Bronze buttons and decorative elements were integrated into the fabric during construction, creating garments that served as displays of both textile craftsmanship and metalworking expertise. The combination of imported bronze ornaments with locally produced textiles demonstrates the integration of international trade goods into everyday life among elite Bronze Age communities. But the EGT girl's story goes far beyond her possessions. Chemical analysis of her hair has provided remarkable insights into her geographic origins and mobility patterns during her lifetime. Strontium isotope analysis indicates that she spent her childhood in a region with different geological characteristics than central Jutland, most likely in the Black Forest region of southwestern Germany. This evidence suggests that she traveled over 800 kilometers from her birthplace to her final burial location, indicating mobility patterns that connected Bronze Age communities across vast distances. She wasn't just a local girl who happened to own nice things. She was a traveler, possibly a bride sent to seal an alliance between distant elite families, a living link between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of forest, mountain, and sea. The implications of this long-distance movement are staggering. Elite families in the Nordic Bronze Age arranged marriages across distances that would challenge modern transportation systems, creating political and economic connections that transcended local territorial boundaries. The EGTvid girl may have been a princess, sent from her homeland to marry a foreign chief, bringing with her not just her personal possessions, but also knowledge, connections, and legitimacy that strengthened both families. Her burial, with its elaborate grave goods and careful preservation, suggests that she was valued and mourned, that her death at such a young age was a tragedy that her adopted community commemorated with the finest funeral they could provide. Archaeological evidence from workshop sites throughout the Nordic Bronze Age cultural zone reveals the organizational systems that supported these technological achievements and made possible the production of objects like the Trundholm chariot and the Egyptived girls' ornaments. Bronze working required not only skilled craftsmen, but also supporting specialists including charcoal producers, mold makers, and finishing workers. The concentration of bronze production in specific locations suggests that communities developed specialized manufacturing centers that served regional markets, rather than attempting to maintain bronze working capabilities in every settlement. The workshop excavations at Pile in Sweden provide detailed evidence of Bronze Age manufacturing organization that reveals the industrial scale of Nordic bronze production. The site contains remains of multiple furnaces, large quantities of bronze scrap and casting waste, and specialized tools for metalworking. The archaeological deposits suggest continuous occupation by bronze-working specialists over several generations, with techniques and knowledge passed down through family lineages. Similar workshop sites at Thai in Denmark and Voltoft in southern Sweden confirm that bronze production had become sufficiently specialized to support full-time craftsmen who devoted their entire careers to metalworking. The quality control systems that ensured consistent standards across Nordic Bronze Age metalwork required sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and manufacturing techniques that would not be matched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. Chemical analysis of bronze objects from different regions reveals remarkably consistent copper-tin ratios, typically ranging between 8 and 12% tin content. This consistency could only have been achieved through careful measurement and standardized production methods. The development of standard alloy compositions also facilitated recycling of bronze objects, allowing craftsmen to melt down damaged or obsolete items to create new products without compromising quality. The sophisticated bronze working techniques and extensive trade networks that characterize the mature Nordic Bronze Age created the foundation for increasingly complex social stratification that would transform Scandinavian society in ways that still echo through history today. By 1400 BC, archaeological evidence reveals the emergence of a distinct warrior elite whose power derived from their control over metal production, trade routes, and military technology. This transformation represented a fundamental shift from the relatively egalitarian societies of the earlier Bronze Age, establishing hierarchical systems that would influence Scandinavian social organization for centuries to come, and eventually give rise to the Viking warriors who would terrorize Europe millennia later. The weapons that defined this warrior class represented the pinnacle of Nordic Bronze Age metallurgical achievement, objects so finely crafted that modern metallurgists study them to understand the limits of what bronze technology could achieve. The distinctive Nordic sword types that emerged during this period demonstrate both technical sophistication and standardized production methods that suggest centralized control over weapon manufacture. These weren't crude clubs or simple stabbing implements. These were precision instruments of death, designed by experts, manufactured by specialists, and wielded by trained warriors who devoted their lives to mastering the art of combat. The earliest Nordic swords, appearing around 1600 BC, evolved from Central European prototypes, but quickly developed characteristic regional features that distinguish them from contemporary weapons produced elsewhere in Europe. The Type 1 Nordic swords, dating to approximately 1600 to 1500 BC, featured broad leaf-shaped blades with pronounced central ridges that provided structural strength while maintaining relatively light weight. These weapons measured between 60 and 80 centimeters in total length, with blades accounting for roughly 2/3 of their overall dimensions. The tangs, designed to fit into organic handles secured with bronze rivets, showed careful attention to balance and ergonomics. Chemical analysis reveals consistent alloy compositions, averaging 10 to 11% tin, indicating quality control standards that required sophisticated understanding of metallurgy. The evolution to Type II swords around 1500 BC marked a significant advancement in both design and manufacturing techniques that reflected centuries of accumulated experience and experimentation. These weapons featured narrower blades with more pronounced tapering toward the point, creating superior thrusting capabilities while maintaining effective cutting edges. The development of flanged hilts cast as integral parts of the blade, rather than attached separately, eliminated weak points that had plagued earlier designs. The bronze hilts often incorporated decorative spiral motifs that served both aesthetic and functional purposes, providing improved grip while displaying the symbolic elements central to Nordic Bronze Age cosmology. Type III swords, appearing around 1300 BC, represented the culmination of Nordic sword development and the absolute pinnacle of Bronze Age weapon technology anywhere in the world. These weapons featured complex hilt constructions, with multiple bronze elements including pommel caps, grip sections, and guard plates. The blades showed increasingly sophisticated metallurgical techniques, with some examples displaying pattern welding or controlled carbon content variations that created superior cutting edges. The overall length of Type III swords increased to 90 to 100 centimeters, reflecting improved bronze supply chains that made larger weapons economically feasible. The production of these swords required exceptional skill and represented enormous investments in both raw materials and labor that only the wealthiest members of society could afford. A typical Type III sword contained approximately 600 to 800 grams of bronze, equivalent to the metal content of dozens of smaller tools or ornaments. The manufacturing process involved multiple stages of casting, forging, grinding, and polishing that could require weeks of work by skilled craftsmen. The consistent quality of Nordic swords across the entire cultural zone indicates that weapon production was concentrated in specialized workshops under the control of elite patrons who could afford such substantial investments. Spear technology developed alongside sword production, creating complementary weapon systems that equipped Nordic warriors for different tactical situations and made them formidable opponents in any combat scenario. Bronze spearheads from the period display remarkable variety in size and form, ranging from light javelins designed for throwing to heavy thrusting spears intended for close combat. The socketed construction, typical of Nordic spearheads, required sophisticated casting techniques to create the hollow bronze sockets that fitted over wooden shafts. The sockets were often reinforced with bronze loops or rings that prevented splitting of the wooden shafts under combat stress. The largest Nordic spearheads, measuring up to 50 centimeters in length, represented formidable weapons that combined the reach advantages of polearms with the cutting power of swords. These massive points required substantial bronze investments and demonstrated the wealth and status of their owners. Archaeological context suggests that the largest spearheads served ceremonial as well as practical functions, appearing in ritual deposits and elite burials where their symbolic significance equaled their military utility. A warrior carrying such a weapon was making a statement about his power, his wealth, and his willingness to use violence to protect his interests. Axe technology during the Nordic Bronze Age reflected both practical tool requirements and symbolic warrior traditions inherited from earlier battle axe cultures that had dominated the region for centuries before bronze arrived. bronze axes evolved from simple flat designs to sophisticated socketed forms that provided superior hafting strength and versatility. The development of flanged axes around 1400 BC created weapons that combined effective cutting edges with decorative elements that displayed the metalworking skills of their creators. The ceremonial aspects of Nordic Bronze Age axes became increasingly elaborate as the period progressed, transforming functional tools into objects of art and religious significance. Examples from elite contexts feature intricate decorative schemes, including spiral motifs, geometric patterns, and occasionally figural representations. The famous axes from Smorum and Freylev in Denmark display complex decorative programs that transform functional weapons into artistic masterpieces worthy of museum display. These ceremonial axes often show minimal wear patterns, suggesting that their primary function involved display and ritual rather than practical combat or tool use. Defensive equipment represented another crucial element of warrior technology, though the organic materials used in shield and armor construction have rarely survived in archaeological contexts. Bronze shield bosses and rim fittings provide evidence for sophisticated defensive systems that complemented the offensive weapons of the warrior elite. The shield bosses, typically measuring 15 to 20 centimeters in diameter, were designed to deflect weapon strikes while providing secure attachment points for leather or wooden shield bodies. A skilled warrior could use his shield not just for defense but as an offensive weapon, punching with the boss to stun opponents or create openings for sword strikes. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hertzsprung in Germany reveals bronze cuirasses that protected the torsos of elite warriors, armor so sophisticated that it challenges assumptions about prehistoric military technology. These armor pieces, constructed from sheet bronze using techniques similar to those employed in cauldron production, required careful fitting to individual wearers and substantial bronze investments. The rarity of such armor pieces suggests that they were restricted to the highest levels of the warrior hierarchy, serving as much to display wealth and status as to provide battlefield protection. A warrior wearing bronze armor was virtually invulnerable to the weapons of his time, a walking tank who could wade through enemy formations with near impunity. The burial practices of the Nordic Bronze Age provide the clearest evidence for the social stratification that accompanied the rise of warrior elites, revealing a society divided into distinct classes with dramatically different access to wealth, power, and prestige. The contrast between simple cremation burials and elaborate barrow interments reveals dramatic differences in social status that had not existed during earlier periods. The simplest burials of the period consisted of cremated remains placed in ceramic urns with minimal grave goods, typically including only basic bronze pins, razors, or small tools. These were the burials of common people, farmers and craftsmen who lived and died without leaving much mark on the archaeological record. At the opposite extreme, the great barrow burials of the elite required enormous labor investments and contained grave goods worth fortunes in contemporary terms. The Borum Eshoj mounds in Denmark, constructed around 1400 BC, demonstrate the scale of resources that elite families could command. Each mound required the movement of thousands of cubic meters of earth and stone, representing months of labor by large work crews. The construction of a single elite burial mound might require more labor than building a modern house, all to commemorate a single individual whose status demanded such elaborate treatment. The preservation conditions within these mounds allowed organic materials to survive, providing unprecedented insights into elite burial practices and material culture. The primary burial at Borum Eshoj contained the remains of a man dressed in a woolen tunic and cap, accompanied by a bronze sword, dagger, belt ornaments, and a distinctive bronze-bound wooden cup. The sword, measuring 75 centimeters in length, displayed exceptional craftsmanship, with intricate spiral decorations on the hilt and a blade polished to mirror brightness. The dagger, worn at the belt alongside the sword, featured a cast bronze hilt with organic grip elements secured by bronze rivets. The belt itself incorporated multiple bronze ornaments, including decorated plates, rings, and a large circular boss that served as both functional and decorative elements. The secondary burials within the same mound contained the remains of a woman and child, both dressed in elaborate woolen garments with bronze ornaments. The woman wore a bronze belt with hanging ornaments, arm rings, and a bronze pin that secured her cloak. The child's burial included miniature bronze objects that may have represented toys or symbols of future adult status. The presence of multiple burials within single mounds suggests family-based elite groups that maintained their status across generations, dynasties of warrior chiefs who passed power from father to son for centuries. The distribution of barrow burials across the Nordic Bronze Age landscape reveals patterns of territorial control and social organization that illuminate the political structure of this ancient society. The largest and richest barrows cluster in specific regions, particularly in Jutland, Zealand, and Scania, suggesting that these areas served as centers of elite power. The spacing between major barrow groups corresponds roughly to distances that could be controlled by individual chieftains or ruling families, indicating territorial divisions that may have persisted for centuries. Each chief controlled his territory, extracted tribute from his subjects, and competed with neighboring chiefs for resources, prestige, and power. The role of warrior chiefs in controlling trade routes becomes evident through the distribution of exotic imports in elite burials. Objects of foreign manufacture, including Central European bronze types, amber from distant Baltic shores, and occasionally items from even more remote regions, appear almost exclusively in the richest graves. This pattern suggests that access to long-distance trade networks was restricted to the highest levels of society, providing warrior chiefs with both economic advantages and symbols of their international connections. If you wanted foreign goods, you had to go through the chief. If you wanted to trade, you needed the chief's permission. The chiefs were gatekeepers, controlling the flow of wealth and using that control to maintain their power. The concentration of bronze working near elite burial sites indicates direct control over metal production by warrior chief families. Archaeological evidence from sites like Thai in Denmark reveals bronze workshops located within easy reach of major barrow cemeteries, suggesting that metal production served the immediate needs of local elites before supplying broader regional markets. The standardization of weapon types across the Nordic region required coordination between different workshop centers, implying networks of communication and cooperation among elite groups. The chiefs didn't just control trade, they controlled production itself, ensuring that the finest weapons and ornaments went to themselves and their allies. The warrior chiefs appear to have maintained their authority through a combination of military leadership, economic control, and ritual functions that made them indispensable to their communities. Rock art depictions from sites throughout Scandinavia show armed figures engaged in ceremonial activities, suggesting that warrior status involved religious as well as secular responsibilities. The consistent appearance of weapon motifs in rock art indicates that martial identity had become central to elite self-representation and social legitimacy. A chief wasn't just a war leader, he was a priest, a judge, a protector, a father figure for his entire community. His authority derived from multiple sources, making it nearly impossible to challenge. The gender roles evident in Nordic Bronze Age burial practices reveal complex systems of status and authority that extended beyond simple male warrior dominance. While the most elaborate weapon burials typically contain male remains, female elite burials demonstrate that women could achieve high status through different pathways. The analysis of female burials reveals distinctive patterns of grave goods that suggest specialized roles within elite society. Women weren't just passive recipients of male protection, they were active participants in the social, economic, and religious life of their communities. The EGTV'd girl burial provides exceptional insights into female elite status during the Nordic Bronze Age. Dating to approximately 1370 BC, this burial contained the remarkably preserved remains of a young woman aged 16 to 18 years at death. The preservation conditions allowed detailed analysis of her clothing, ornaments, and associated grave goods, revealing the material culture of elite women during this period. The bronze objects accompanying the EGTV dead girl included a large belt plate decorated with intricate spiral motifs, demonstrating the same high-quality metalwork found in male elite burials. The belt plate, measuring 23 centimeters in diameter, required substantial bronze investment and exceptional craftsmanship to produce. Chemical analysis reveals alloy compositions consistent with the finest bronze objects of the period, indicating that female elites had access to the same quality materials as their male counterparts. The woolen textiles preserved in the EGTV burial reveal sophisticated production techniques that suggest specialized female craft traditions. The woman's dress was constructed from fine woolen fabric woven in complex patterns that required advanced loom technology and exceptional skill in thread preparation. The integration of bronze ornaments into the textile construction demonstrates coordination between male-dominated metalwork and female-controlled textile production, suggesting complementary rather than competitive gender roles within elite society. The presence of a small bronze AWL in the EGTV burial indicates that elite women maintained involvement in craft production even after achieving high status. The AWL, used for leatherworking and textile production, shows wear patterns consistent with regular use, suggesting that craft skills remained important aspects of female identity, even among the elite. This pattern contrasts with male elite burials, where tools typically appear as symbols rather than functional implements. Elite men displayed their status through weapons they might never use in actual combat. Elite women displayed their status through tools they actually used, demonstrating their productive contributions to household economies. Other female elite burials from the period reveal similar patterns of high-status grave goods, combined with evidence for craft specialization. The Skridstrup burial from Denmark contained bronze ornaments comparable to those found with the EGTV girl, including arm rings, belt fittings, and decorative pins. The preservation of organic materials revealed woolen garments of exceptional quality, including a complex hairnet constructed from horsehair threads and decorated with bronze spirals. The Skridstrup woman's elaborate hairstyle, preserved in extraordinary detail, reveals the sophistication of Bronze Age hair arrangement techniques and the importance placed on personal appearance among elite women. The distribution of female elite burials across the Nordic Bronze Age landscape suggests that high-status women were not concentrated in the same locations as the richest male warrior burials. This pattern may indicate marriage alliances that connected different elite groups across regional boundaries, with women serving as links between otherwise separate power centers. The consistency of female elite material culture across wide geographic areas supports this interpretation. suggesting shared traditions that transcended local territorial divisions. Elite women were diplomats, their marriages sealing alliances between powerful families, their children inheriting connections to multiple lineages. The elaborate material culture and complex social hierarchies that defined Nordic Bronze Age society reflected underlying religious and cosmological systems of remarkable sophistication that governed every aspect of life, from birth to death and beyond. The spiritual beliefs that governed these communities extended far beyond simple ancestor worship or nature reverence, encompassing complex astronomical knowledge, elaborate ritual practices, and symbolic systems that unified diverse populations across vast geographic territories. Understanding Nordic Bronze Age religion means understanding the worldview that motivated people to create the Trundholm sun chariot, to deposit precious bronze in bogs and lakes, to carve thousands of images into rock surfaces across Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence reveals that religious activities permeated every aspect of Bronze Age life, from the decoration of everyday objects to the construction of monumental ceremonial sites that required enormous communal investments. The rock art traditions that flourished throughout Scandinavia during the Bronze Age provide the most extensive surviving evidence of Nordic spiritual beliefs and practices. These carved images, numbering in the tens of thousands across sites from Alta in northern Norway to Simris in southern Sweden, represent one of Europe's largest concentrations of prehistoric art. The consistency of motifs and artistic conventions across this vast geographic range indicates shared religious traditions that transcended local political and cultural boundaries. The Tanum Rock Art Complex in Bohuslän, western Sweden, contains over 3,000 individual carvings distributed across more than 600 separate panels, making it the largest and most diverse collection of Bronze Age rock art in Scandinavia. The site's location on what were then islands and coastal promontories in the Skagerrak demonstrates the intimate connection between Bronze Age religious practices and maritime activities. The carvings at Tanum span the entire Bronze Age period, with the earliest images dating to approximately 1700 BC and the latest additions continuing into the early Iron Age around 500 BC. For over 1,000 years, people came to these rocks to carve images that express their deepest beliefs about the nature of reality. The ship motifs that dominate Tanum and other Scandinavian rock art sites reveal the central importance of maritime technology and seafaring in Bronze Age cosmology. These vessels, depicted in profile with characteristic curved prows and sterns, appear in contexts ranging from simple transportation scenes to elaborate ritual processions involving dozens of participants. The ships vary dramatically in size and crew complement, from small vessels operated by 2 or 3 figures to massive craft requiring 20 or more rowers. The largest ship carvings at Tanum measure over 4 meters in length, suggesting that these images represented idealized or mythological vessels rather than accurate depictions of contemporary boats. The artistic conventions used to depict Bronze Age ships reveal sophisticated understanding of symbolic representation and narrative composition. The vessels typically appear as single-line drawings showing the hull profile with vertical strokes representing crew members. The prows and sterns often feature elaborate decorative elements, including animal heads, spiral motifs, and geometric designs that mirror the ornamental systems found on contemporary bronze objects. Some ships display masts and rigging, indicating that the artists were familiar with sailing technology even when depicting vessels under oar power. The contextual associations of ship carvings provide insights into their religious and ceremonial significance that go far beyond simple documentation of maritime technology. Many vessels appear in procession scenes, where multiple ships follow identical courses across the rock surfaces, suggesting ritual journeys or ceremonial voyages. The association of ships with human figures engaged in various activities, including apparent ritual dances, weapon displays, and sexual acts, indicates that maritime imagery served broader symbolic functions beyond simple transportation documentation. Ships weren't just vehicles. They were sacred objects, carriers of souls, connections between the world of the living and the realm of the gods. The warrior figures that appear throughout Scandinavian rock art demonstrate the religious dimensions of Bronze Age martial culture. These armed figures, typically depicted with swords, spears, axes, and shields, engage in combat scenes, ritual dances, and ceremonial processions that reveal the spiritual significance of warrior identity. The consistent artistic conventions used to represent warriors across different sites indicate standardized iconographic traditions that communicated specific religious and social meanings. A warrior wasn't just a fighter, he was a sacred figure, a protector blessed by the gods, a hero whose deeds would be remembered for generations. The combat scenes depicted in Bronze Age rock art follow recognizable patterns that suggest ritualized rather than chaotic warfare. Warriors typically appear in pairs or small groups engaged in formal duels or structured battles that emphasize individual skill and heroism. The weapons depicted in these scenes correspond closely to archaeological finds from contemporary sites, indicating that the artists accurately represented the military technology of their time. The presence of apparent referees or observers in some combat scenes suggests that warfare had become ceremonially regulated according to specific codes of conduct. The ritual aspects of warrior imagery become particularly evident in scenes depicting armed figures engaged in apparent religious activities. Warriors appear as participants in processions, as guardians of sacred sites, and as central figures in complex ceremonial compositions that include ships, animals, and astronomical symbols. The integration of martial and religious imagery indicates that warrior status involved spiritual as well as secular responsibilities, with elite fighters serving as intermediaries between human communities and divine powers. Animal imagery in Nordic Bronze Age rock art reveals complex relationships between human communities and the natural world that surrounded them. The most common animal representations include horses, cattle, deer, wild boar, and various bird species, each appearing in specific contexts that suggest distinct symbolic meanings. The artistic treatment of these animals ranges from naturalistic depictions that accurately represent anatomical details to highly stylized forms that emphasize particular characteristics or symbolic associations. Horse imagery holds particular significance in Bronze Age rock art, appearing in contexts that range from practical transportation to elaborate religious ceremonies. The horses depicted at Tanum and other sites often appear as draft animals pulling wheeled vehicles, including both practical carts and ceremonial chariots. The association of horses with sun symbols and other astronomical motifs suggests that these animals played important roles in Bronze Age cosmological beliefs, possibly representing divine messengers or vehicles for celestial journeys. The Trundholm Sun Chariot, with its bronze horse pulling the golden sun disk, represents the physical manifestation of beliefs depicted countless times in rock art. The wild animals depicted in rock art provide insights into the environmental conditions and hunting practices of Bronze Age Scandinavia. Red deer appear frequently in hunting scenes that show human figures armed with bows and spears pursuing individual animals or entire herds. The artistic treatment of these scenes suggests that hunting retained important ritual dimensions, even as agricultural production became the primary subsistence strategy. The presence of antlered figures that combine human and animal characteristics indicates shamanistic traditions that involved spiritual transformation and communication with animal spirits. Solar symbols represent perhaps the most widespread and consistent element in Nordic Bronze Age rock art, appearing in various forms across sites throughout Scandinavia. These symbols range from simple circular designs to elaborate compositions featuring radiating lines, spiral elements, and complex geometric patterns. The consistency of solar imagery across different artistic traditions indicates that sun worship formed a central element of Bronze Age religious beliefs throughout the Nordic cultural zone. The most common solar symbols consist of circles with radiating lines that clearly represent the sun and its rays. These images appear in isolation and as components of larger compositions that include ships, warriors, and animals. The contextual associations of solar symbols reveal their integration into broader narrative and ceremonial programs. Ships frequently display solar disks as decorative elements or cargo, suggesting that maritime activities involve the transportation of sacred solar symbols or the ritual reenactment of celestial journeys. The spiral motifs that appear throughout Nordic Bronze Age art represent sophisticated understanding of cyclical time and astronomical phenomena. These spirals range from simple single-turn designs to complex compositions featuring multiple interlocking elements that create elaborate geometric patterns. The mathematical precision evident in many spiral compositions indicates advanced understanding of geometric principles and careful planning in their execution. The spirals weren't random decorations. They were calculated designs that expressed specific cosmological concepts. The astronomical knowledge demonstrated through Bronze Age artifacts extends far beyond simple solar observation to encompass sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles and seasonal changes. The Trundholm Sun Chariot represents the most famous example of Bronze Age astronomical artifacts, but numerous other objects reveal equally advanced understanding of celestial phenomena. Bronze razors from the period often featured decorative schemes that incorporate astronomical symbols, including representations of the sun, moon, and star patterns that correspond to observable celestial configurations. The Nibra sky disk, though discovered in Saxony, incorporates materials and artistic traditions from across Northern Europe and demonstrates the international scope of Bronze Age astronomical knowledge. This bronze disk, decorated with gold inlays representing the sun, moon, and star clusters, provides direct evidence for sophisticated astronomical observation and record-keeping. The disk's construction required coordination between craftsmen familiar with different metalworking traditions, suggesting networks of technical and religious knowledge that transcended political boundaries. The seasonal orientation of many Bronze Age monuments and rock art sites reveals systematic astronomical observations that guided religious and agricultural activities. The alignment of stone ship settings and other ceremonial monuments with solar and stellar events indicates that Bronze Age communities maintained detailed calendrical systems that coordinated religious festivals with agricultural cycles and seasonal changes. These weren't primitive people guessing at the movements of celestial bodies. These were sophisticated observers who tracked the heavens with precision that would not be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. Water held profound religious significance in Nordic Bronze Age spiritual systems, serving as a medium for communication with divine powers and a repository for sacred objects. The extensive evidence for votive deposits in bogs, lakes, and rivers throughout Scandinavia reveals systematic practices of ritual deposition that continued throughout the Bronze Age period. These deposits represent some of the largest concentrations of Bronze Age metalwork ever discovered, indicating enormous investments in religious activities. The bog deposits at Fardel in Denmark contained over 100 bronze objects, including weapons, tools, ornaments, and ceremonial items that represent substantial wealth accumulations. The objects show evidence of deliberate damage before deposition, with swords bent or broken, and other items rendered functionally useless. This intentional destruction indicates that the deposits served ritual rather than practical storage functions, with the objects permanently removed from circulation as offerings to supernatural powers. People weren't hiding their valuables for later retrieval. They were giving them away forever, sacrificing wealth to gain divine favor. The types of objects selected for water deposits reveal specific patterns that illuminate Bronze Age religious beliefs. Weapons appear disproportionately in votive deposits, particularly high-quality swords and spears that represent significant material investments. The selection of the finest available weapons for ritual deposition suggests that martial prowess held religious as well as social significance, with successful warriors obligated to share their achievements with divine patrons through substantial offerings. The lure horns found in Danish and Swedish bogs represent another category of ritual deposits with specifically religious functions. These massive bronze instruments, weighing up to 10 kilograms each and measuring over 2 meters in length, required exceptional technical skill to produce and enormous bronze investments to create. The acoustic properties of lures indicate that they were designed to produce specific tonal qualities suitable for ceremonial rather than practical communication purposes. The discovery of lure pairs in bog contexts suggests that these instruments functioned in coordinated performances that may have accompanied major religious ceremonies. The technical requirements for playing lures demanded specialized training and considerable physical strength, indicating that their operation was restricted to trained specialists. The decoration of lure horns with the same spiral motifs found on other Bronze Age religious objects confirms their integration into broader symbolic systems. When the lures sounded, their deep, resonant tones must have seemed like the voice of the gods themselves, echoing across the landscape and calling communities to worship. The geographical distribution of water deposits reveals patterns that correspond to territorial divisions and settlement hierarchies evident in other aspects of Bronze Age society. The largest and richest deposits cluster in regions that also contain the most elaborate elite burials and evidence for specialized bronze production, suggesting that ritual depositions serve to legitimize social hierarchies and territorial claims. The investment of substantial wealth in water deposits may have demonstrated the prosperity and divine favor enjoyed by particular communities or elite groups. The seasonal timing of ritual deposits, where this can be determined through archaeological evidence, indicates coordination with agricultural cycles and astronomical events. The deposition of bronze objects during specific seasons may have served to ensure favorable weather, successful harvests, or protection from natural disasters. The integration of ritual deposition with seasonal cycles demonstrates the sophisticated understanding of natural phenomena that characterized Bronze Age religious systems. Sacred landscapes and ceremonial sites throughout the Nordic Bronze Age cultural zone reveal sophisticated understanding of topographic and astronomical relationships that guided the placement of religious monuments. The stone ship settings that appear throughout Scandinavia represent one of the most distinctive forms of Bronze Age ceremonial architecture, combining maritime symbolism with astronomical alignments to create complex sacred spaces. The stone ship at Älvstenar in southern Sweden, measuring 67 meters in length and consisting of 59 standing stones, demonstrates the monumental scale that Bronze Age communities could achieve in their ceremonial constructions. The precise astronomical alignments of this monument with its long axis oriented towards sunrise and sunset at the winter and summer solstices, reveals sophisticated astronomical knowledge and careful planning in its construction. The effort required to transport and erect the massive stones indicates community-wide participation in religious activities. The smaller stone ship settings found throughout Denmark and Sweden display similar astronomical orientations and construction techniques, suggesting standardized religious practices that were maintained across wide geographic areas. The consistent use of maritime symbolism in these monuments confirms the central importance of seafaring in Bronze Age cosmology and religious belief systems. Ships carried the living across the seas. Ships carried the dead to the afterlife. Ships carried the sun across the sky. The ship was the universal symbol of journey, transformation, and connection between worlds. The sophisticated religious and ceremonial systems that characterized mature Nordic Bronze Age society required substantial agricultural surpluses to support specialized craftsmen, warriors, and religious practitioners. The transition from the predominantly pastoral economies of the early Bronze Age to the intensive mixed farming systems that emerged around 1400 BC represented a fundamental transformation in subsistence strategies that enabled population growth and territorial expansion throughout Scandinavia. This agricultural revolution involved not merely the adoption of new crops or farming techniques, but the development of comprehensive land management systems that maximized productivity while maintaining long-term sustainability. Archaeological evidence from sites across Denmark and southern Sweden reveals the systematic establishment of permanent field systems during the sub-boreal climatic period, roughly 1500 to 800 BC. These field systems, preserved as fossil landscapes beneath later agricultural deposits, demonstrate sophisticated understanding of soil management, drainage, and crop rotation that enabled sustained, intensive cultivation. The field boundaries, marked by stone walls and earthen banks, created parcels ranging from 0.5 to 2 hectares in size, optimal dimensions for the agricultural technology available during the Bronze Age. The excavations at Bjerre in Jutland have revealed one of the most complete Bronze Age field systems yet discovered, consisting of over 40 individual plots arranged in a grid pattern covering approximately 50 hectares. The field boundaries show evidence for multiple construction phases, indicating that the system developed gradually over several generations. Soil analysis from within the ancient fields reveals evidence for manuring, crop rotation, and systematic weed control that maintained soil fertility despite intensive cultivation. The presence of bronze sickles and other agricultural tools in associated settlement contexts confirms that these fields supported communities with access to metal technology. The development of systematic manuring practices represented a crucial innovation that enabled sustained intensive agriculture. Archaeological deposits from Bronze Age settlements contain substantial quantities of animal dung mixed with household refuse, straw, and other organic materials that were systematically applied to cultivated fields. The analysis of ancient soil samples reveals elevated phosphate levels and other chemical signatures that indicate regular manure application over extended periods. This practice required careful coordination between animal husbandry and crop production, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of agricultural chemistry. The crop assemblages recovered from Bronze Age sites reveal diversified agricultural systems that combined cereal cultivation with legume production and specialized crops for textile and craft production. Barley remained the dominant cereal throughout the period, particularly the 6-row hulled varieties that thrived in Scandinavian climatic conditions. However, the appearance of wheat cultivation in southern Denmark and Scania indicates agricultural intensification and possibly status differentiation, as wheat required better soils and more favorable growing conditions than barley. The cultivation of emmer wheat at sites like Bierre and Sarup demonstrates that Bronze Age farmers had developed techniques for growing this demanding crop in marginal northern environments. Emmer requires careful soil preparation, regular weeding, and protection from pests that made it considerably more labor-intensive than barley cultivation. The investment in emmer production suggests that Bronze Age communities valued wheat for specific purposes, possibly including ritual consumption or trade with elite groups who preferred wheat-based foods. The legume cultivation that appears in Bronze Age agricultural assemblages provided crucial protein supplementation and soil improvement through nitrogen fixation. Field peas and broad beans appear in substantial quantities at settlement sites throughout Denmark and southern Sweden, indicating systematic cultivation rather than casual gathering. The integration of legumes into crop rotation systems demonstrates sophisticated understanding of soil chemistry and plant nutrition that enabled sustained productivity without external fertilizer inputs. Flax cultivation became increasingly important during the later Bronze Age, providing raw materials for textile production that complemented wool from domesticated sheep. The processing of flax required specialized knowledge and equipment, including retting ponds for fiber preparation and stone weights for loom operation. The presence of flax processing facilities at Bronze Age settlements indicates that textile production had become sufficiently important to warrant dedicated infrastructure and specialized labor allocation. The evidence for Bronze Age agricultural intensification extends beyond crop cultivation to encompass systematic landscape modification that maximized productive potential. The construction of drainage systems in low-lying areas enabled cultivation of previously waterlogged soils, expanding the total area available for agriculture. Archaeological surveys in Jutland have identified Bronze Age drainage ditches that channeled water from marshy areas into constructed ponds and channels, creating extensive new agricultural lands. The terracing systems constructed on hill slopes throughout southern Scandinavia demonstrate Bronze Age understanding of erosion control and water management. These terraces, built with stone retaining walls and earth fill, created level planting surfaces that prevented soil loss while maximizing solar exposure. The construction of agricultural terraces required substantial labor investments and community coordination, indicating that Bronze Age societies could mobilize large workforces for agricultural improvement projects. The forest clearance activities that accompanied agricultural expansion left distinctive signatures in pollen records throughout Scandinavia. The systematic removal of oak, elm, and other deciduous trees created open landscapes dominated by agricultural crops and pasture grasses. However, Bronze Age communities maintained careful forest management practices that preserved woodlands for fuel, construction materials, and specialized products like hazelnuts and berries. The coppicing systems evident in Bronze Age forest remains demonstrate sophisticated woodland management that maximized sustainable timber production. These techniques involved cutting trees at regular intervals to promote rapid regrowth of straight poles suitable for construction and tool making. The evidence for selective tree management indicates that Bronze Age communities understood the long-term consequences of deforestation and developed practices that balanced immediate needs with future resource availability. Animal husbandry during the Nordic Bronze Age evolved from simple pastoral systems to complex integrated operations that supported both subsistence needs and specialized production for trade and craft activities. Cattle remained the most important domesticated animals throughout the period. providing meat, milk, leather, and traction power for agricultural operations. The size and conformation of Bronze Age cattle, determined through analysis of skeletal remains, reveal selective breeding programs that produced animals optimized for specific functions. The evidence for cattle breeding specialization includes the development of distinct types suited for draft work versus milk and meat production. The larger cattle bones found at elite settlement sites suggest that high-status communities maintained breeding herds of superior animals that served both practical and prestige functions. The investment in cattle breeding required substantial resources and long-term planning, indicating that Bronze Age communities had developed sophisticated animal management systems. Sheep husbandry expanded significantly during the Bronze Age, driven by increasing demand for wool for textile production and trade. The analysis of sheep bones from Bronze Age sites reveals animals that were considerably larger than their Neolithic predecessors, indicating selective breeding for improved wool production. The development of specialized wool sheep required careful management of breeding programs and grazing systems that maximized fiber quality while maintaining herd health. The seasonal movement of sheep flocks between summer and winter pastures, a practice known as transhumance, became one of the defining features of Nordic Bronze Age society. This was not simply a matter of moving animals from one place to another. It was a complex, carefully orchestrated system that required intimate knowledge of geography, weather patterns, animal behavior, and social negotiation. The shepherds who guided their flocks across hundreds of kilometers of terrain were not mere laborers but specialists whose expertise was essential to the survival of entire communities. In summer, the flocks were driven to highland pastures where the grass grew thick and nutritious in the long days of the midnight sun. These summer pastures, known in later Scandinavian tradition as sater or shealing grounds, were often located in remote mountain valleys or on islands where predators were few and grazing was abundant. The journey to these pastures could take weeks, following ancient routes that had been used for generations. Along the way, the shepherds would stop at traditional camping sites, some of which show archaeological evidence of use spanning centuries. The summer months were a time of relative ease for the flocks. The animals grazed freely on the lush mountain vegetation, building up fat reserves that would sustain them through the harsh winter months. The shepherds, meanwhile, processed the wool and milk that the animals produced. Wool was sheared, cleaned, and spun into thread. Milk was transformed into cheese and butter that could be stored for months. These products were then transported back to the lowland settlements, where they formed a crucial part of the community's food supply and trade goods. As autumn approached and the first frosts began to touch the highland pastures, the flocks were driven back down to the lowlands. The winter pastures were typically located in sheltered valleys or coastal areas where the climate was milder, and fodder could be supplemented with stored hay and grain. The animals were kept in enclosed pastures or even brought into specially constructed barns during the coldest months. This close confinement required careful management to prevent disease and ensure that all animals received adequate nutrition. The wool produced by these carefully managed flocks was of exceptional quality. Nordic Bronze Age textiles, preserved in the anaerobic conditions of bogs and burial mounds, reveal a level of sophistication that rivals anything produced in the ancient Mediterranean world. The weavers of the north created fabrics with complex patterns, multiple colors, and textures ranging from coarse, durable work clothes to fine, soft garments suitable for the elite. Some textiles show evidence of techniques that would not become common in other parts of Europe for centuries. The famous Egtved girl, buried around 1370 BCE in what is now Denmark, was dressed in a short corded skirt, and a short-sleeved blouse that demonstrate the remarkable skill of Nordic weavers. The skirt, made of wool cords hanging from a woven waistband, would have swayed and moved with every step, creating a visual effect that must have been striking. The blouse, woven from fine wool thread, was decorated with bronze ornaments that clinked softly as she moved. This was not the clothing of a primitive people, but of a sophisticated society with highly developed aesthetic sensibilities. The agricultural surplus produced by Nordic Bronze Age farmers did more than simply feed the population. It created the economic foundation for social complexity. When farmers can produce more food than they need for their own survival, some members of society can specialize in other activities. Craftsmen can devote their time to producing bronze tools and ornaments. Warriors can train for combat rather than working in the fields. Priests can perform rituals and maintain sacred sites. Chiefs can coordinate trade expeditions and diplomatic missions. This division of labor is the hallmark of complex societies, and it was made possible by the agricultural productivity of Nordic Bronze Age farmers. The evidence suggests that Nordic Bronze Age society was highly stratified, with a small elite controlling much of the wealth and power. The elaborate burials of this period, with their rich grave goods of bronze, gold, and amber, were reserved for a tiny fraction of the population. The vast majority of people were buried with few or no grave goods, suggesting that they occupied a much lower social position. Between these extremes were various intermediate ranks: skilled craftsmen, successful farmers, warriors, and traders who enjoyed some measure of prosperity without reaching the heights of the elite. This social hierarchy was maintained through a combination of economic control, military power, and religious authority. The elite controlled access to bronze, the most valuable commodity of the age. They commanded the warriors who protected the community and enforced social order. They sponsored the rituals and sacrifices that maintained the favor of the gods, and they controlled the agricultural surplus that fed the craftsmen, warriors, and priests who supported their power. It was a self-reinforcing system that concentrated wealth and authority in the hands of a few, while the many labored to support them. Yet this system was not simply exploitative. The elite also had obligations to their followers. They were expected to be generous, distributing gifts and hosting feasts that reinforced social bonds. They were expected to protect the community from external threats and to lead in times of war. They were expected to maintain the sacred sites and perform the rituals that ensured the continued favor of the gods. A chief who failed in these obligations risked losing the support of his followers and, ultimately, his position. The relationship between elite and commoner was one of mutual obligation, even if the benefits were unequally distributed. The agricultural landscape of the Nordic Bronze Age was not static but constantly evolving. As population grew and new lands were brought under cultivation, the forest retreated and the open landscape expanded. Pollen analysis from lake sediments and peat bogs shows a dramatic decline in tree pollen and a corresponding increase in the pollen of grasses, cereals, and weeds associated with agriculture. This transformation was not uniform across the region. Some areas were more intensively cultivated than others, and some forests were preserved for hunting, gathering, and ritual purposes. The clearing of forests had profound environmental consequences. Without tree cover, soil erosion increased, and nutrients were washed away by rain. In some areas, the soil became exhausted after years of continuous cultivation, forcing farmers to abandon their fields and clear new land. This pattern of expansion and abandonment left its mark on the landscape in the form of ancient field systems, now overgrown with forest, that can still be detected through aerial photography and archaeological survey. The Nordic Bronze Age farmers also faced the challenge of climate variability. The climate of Northern Europe during this period was generally warmer and drier than today, but it was not constant. There were periods of cooler, wetter weather that reduced crop yields and stressed animal populations. There were droughts that withered crops in the fields and dried up water sources. There were harsh winters that killed livestock and depleted food stores. The farmers of the Nordic Bronze Age developed strategies to cope with this variability, including the storage of surplus grain, the diversification of crops and livestock, and the maintenance of social networks that could provide assistance in times of need. The relationship between humans and the land in the Nordic Bronze Age was not simply one of exploitation, but of reciprocity. The farmers understood that the land provided for them, and they believed that they had obligations to the land in return. This belief found expression in the rituals and sacrifices that accompanied agricultural activities. Before plowing, offerings might be made to ensure a good harvest. After the harvest, the first fruits might be dedicated to the gods. Animals might be sacrificed to ensure the fertility of the flocks. These rituals were not mere superstition, but expressions of a worldview in which humans and nature were bound together in a web of mutual obligation. The bronze smiths of the Nordic Bronze Age were more than mere craftsmen. They were alchemists who transformed raw materials into objects of power and beauty. Their workshops were places of mystery and transformation, where the dull gleam of copper and tin was transmuted into the brilliant shine of bronze. The secrets of their craft were closely guarded, passed down from master to apprentice in a tradition that spanned generations. To the people of the Bronze Age, the smith's ability to melt solid metal and reshape it into new forms must have seemed nothing short of magical. The process of bronze working began long before the metal reached the smith's workshop. Copper ore had to be mined from the earth, a dangerous and labor-intensive process that required specialized knowledge and equipment. The ore then had to be smelted, heated to temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius to extract the pure metal from the surrounding rock. This smelting process required carefully constructed furnaces, a steady supply of charcoal fuel, and the skill to maintain the precise temperatures needed for successful extraction. The resulting copper was then refined and cast into ingots for transport. Tin, the other essential component of bronze, was even more difficult to obtain. The tin deposits of Europe were concentrated in a few locations, most notably Cornwall in southwestern Britain and the Erzgebirge Mountains on the border of modern Germany and the Czech Republic. From these distant sources, tin had to be transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometers to reach the workshops of the Nordic Bronze Age. The tin trade was one of the great commercial enterprises of the ancient world, connecting regions that would otherwise have had little contact with each other. The Nordic smiths received their raw materials in the form of ingots, standardized blocks of metal that could be easily transported and traded. These ingots came in various shapes and sizes, from small bars weighing a few hundred grams to large oxide-shaped ingots weighing tens of kilograms. The shape of the ingot often indicated its origin. Different production centers used distinctive forms that served as a kind of trademark. When a Nordic smith received an ingot, he could often tell at a glance where it had come from and what quality of metal it contained. The actual process of bronze working required a combination of techniques, each demanding its own specialized knowledge and equipment. The most basic technique was casting, in which molten bronze was poured into a mold and allowed to cool into the desired shape. The simplest molds were made of stone, carved with the negative image of the object to be produced. More complex objects required two-piece molds that could be separated to release the finished casting. The most sophisticated technique was lost wax casting, in which a wax model was coated with clay, heated to melt out the wax, and then filled with molten bronze. This technique allowed the production of objects with intricate details that would be impossible to achieve with stone molds. The Nordic smiths were masters of lost wax casting, producing objects of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The famous lures, the great curved horns that are among the most iconic artifacts of the Nordic Bronze Age, were created using this technique. Each lure was cast in multiple sections that were then joined together, a process that required precise planning and flawless execution. The thin walls of the lure tubes, some only a few millimeters thick, demonstrate the smith's ability to control the flow of molten metal with remarkable precision. After casting, bronze objects typically required extensive finishing work. The rough casting was cleaned of any remaining mold material, and the casting sprues, the channels through which the molten metal had been poured, were cut away. The surface was then smoothed and polished using abrasive stones and sand. Decorative details might be added through engraving, punching, or chasing, techniques that involved cutting or pressing patterns into the metal surface. Finally, the object might be given a final polish to bring out the golden shine of the bronze. The decoration of Nordic Bronze Age bronzes followed distinctive stylistic conventions that evolved over time. Early pieces tended to be relatively simple, with geometric patterns of lines, circles, and spirals. Over time, the decoration became increasingly elaborate, incorporating complex interlocking patterns, stylized animal and human figures, and abstract designs whose meaning is now lost to us. Some of the most elaborate decoration is found on the great ceremonial axes and swords that were clearly intended for display rather than practical use. The spiral was perhaps the most characteristic motif of Nordic Bronze Age art. Spirals appear on virtually every type of bronze object, from the smallest fibulae to the largest ceremonial vessels. They are found running in continuous bands around the rims of bowls and the blades of axes. They form the eyes of stylized faces and the bodies of serpentine creatures. They radiate outward from central points like the rays of the sun. The ubiquity of the spiral suggests that it held deep symbolic significance for the people of the Bronze Age, though its precise meaning remains a matter of scholarly debate. Some researchers have suggested that the spiral represented the sun, the most important deity in the Nordic Bronze Age pantheon. The sun's daily journey across the sky and its annual cycle of waxing and waning were central concerns of Bronze Age religion, and the spiral's continuous cyclical form may have been seen as an appropriate symbol for these celestial movements. Others have suggested that the spiral represented water, another element of crucial importance to agricultural societies. Still others see the spiral as a symbol of life force or spiritual energy, a visual representation of the power that animated all living things. The smiths who created these magnificent objects occupied a special position in Nordic Bronze Age society. Their skills were rare and valuable, and they were likely accorded high status and considerable wealth. Archaeological evidence suggests that smiths often worked in close association with the elite, producing the prestige goods that marked high social rank. Some smiths may have been attached to the households of chiefs, working exclusively for their patrons. Others may have been itinerant craftsmen, traveling from settlement to settlement and offering their services to whoever could pay. The smith's workshop was a place of intense activity and specialized equipment. Excavations of Bronze Age smithing sites have revealed the remains of furnaces, crucibles, molds, hammers, anvils, and other tools of the trade. The furnaces were typically small, dome-shaped structures made of clay, designed to concentrate heat and reach the high temperatures needed to melt bronze. Bellows, probably made of leather, were used to force air into the furnace and increase the temperature. The crucibles, small clay vessels in which the metal was melted, show the characteristic vitrification and metal residues that result from repeated heating. The transformation of solid metal into liquid and back again must have seemed miraculous to those who witnessed it. The smith, standing before his glowing furnace, manipulating forces that could destroy as easily as create, was a figure of power and mystery. In many ancient societies, smiths were associated with magic and the supernatural, and there is reason to believe that similar beliefs existed in the Nordic Bronze Age. The smith's ability to transform matter, to take the raw stuff of the earth and reshape it into objects of beauty and utility, set him apart from ordinary mortals. This association between smithing and magic finds expression in later Norse mythology, where the dwarves, master smiths who lived beneath the earth, created the most powerful magical objects of the gods. Thor's hammer Mjolnir, Odin's spear Gungnir, and Freyr's ship Skidbladnir were all products of dwarven craftsmanship. While we cannot directly connect these later myths to Bronze Age beliefs, the continuity of smithing traditions in Scandinavia suggests that some elements of the smith's mystical status may have very ancient roots. The products of the Nordic smiths were not confined to Scandinavia, but traveled far and wide through networks of trade and exchange. Nordic bronzes have been found throughout Northern Europe, from the British Isles to the Baltic states, and even further afield. These objects served as markers of cultural identity, connecting distant communities through shared aesthetic traditions. When a chief in what is now Poland displayed a sword made in the Nordic style, he was signaling his participation in a broader cultural world that transcended local boundaries. The bronze smiths of the North also demonstrated remarkable innovation, developing new techniques and forms that spread to other regions. The Nordic style of spiral decoration, for example, influenced bronze working traditions across much of Northern and Central Europe. The distinctive Nordic sword types, with their elaborate hilts and decorated blades, were imitated and adapted by smiths in distant lands. The lyres, those magnificent musical instruments, appear to have been a purely Nordic invention, with no parallels elsewhere in the Bronze Age world. Yet for all their skill and innovation, the Nordic smiths were ultimately dependent on resources they could not control. The copper and tin that were the foundation of their craft came from distant lands, transported through trade networks that could be disrupted by war, political upheaval, or economic change. When these supply lines faltered, the smiths faced shortages that limited their production. When they failed entirely, the Bronze Age itself came to an end, replaced by a new age of iron that would transform European society once again. The dead of the Nordic Bronze Age speak to us across the millennia, their voices preserved in the objects they took to their graves, and in rare and precious cases, in their own physical remains. The burial practices of this period offer an unparalleled window into the beliefs, values, and social structures of a vanished world. From the humble graves of common farmers to the magnificent burial mounds of the elite, each interment tells a story of life, death, and the hope for something beyond. The most spectacular burials of the Nordic Bronze Age are the great mound graves that still dot the Scandinavian landscape. These monumental structures, some reaching heights of 10 meters or more, required enormous investments of labor and resources. The construction of a single large mound might have taken hundreds of workers several months to complete, moving thousands of cubic meters of earth and stone. Such undertakings were clearly beyond the means of ordinary families. They were statements of power and prestige by the elite families who commissioned them. The burial mounds were not simply piles of earth, but carefully constructed monuments with complex internal architecture. At the center of each mound was a burial chamber, typically constructed of large oak logs or stone slabs. The chamber was designed to house the deceased and their grave goods, protecting them from the weight of the overlying earth and, it was hoped, from grave robbers. Some chambers were large enough to accommodate multiple burials, suggesting that they served as family tombs used over several generations. The preservation conditions within some of these burial chambers have been nothing short of miraculous. The oak log coffins used in many elite burials created an anaerobic environment that prevented the normal processes of decay. Combined with the tannic acid leaching from the oak wood, these conditions preserved organic materials that would normally have disappeared within years of burial. Textiles, leather, wooden objects, and even human remains have survived for over 3,000 years, offering an intimate glimpse into the lives of the people who created them. The Egtved girl, discovered in 1921 in a burial mound near the village of Egtved in Denmark, is perhaps the most famous of these remarkably preserved burials. When archaeologists opened her oak coffin, they found the remains of a young woman, approximately 16 to 18 years old at the time of her death, dressed in the clothing she had worn in life. Her short, corded skirt and cropped blouse, her bronze belt plate and arm rings, her horn comb and small bronze knife, all were preserved in extraordinary detail. Even her hair, blonde and cut short, survived the passage of 3 millennia. But the Egtved girl's burial contained more than just her own remains. At her feet lay a small birch bark container holding the cremated bones of a child, approximately 5 to 6 years old. Near her head was a small bundle containing the cremated remains of another individual. Who were these companions in death? Were they relatives, servants, or sacrificial victims? The questions multiply, and the answers remain elusive. What is clear is that the Egtved girl's burial was a complex ritual event involving multiple individuals and carefully chosen grave goods. Recent scientific analysis has added new dimensions to our understanding of the Egtved girl's life. Strontium isotope analysis of her hair and fingernails revealed that she had traveled extensively in the months before her death. The isotopic signatures suggest that she moved between Denmark and a region far to the south, possibly the Black Forest area of southern Germany, multiple times in her final years. Was she a princess sent to seal a diplomatic alliance? A priestess traveling between sacred sites? A trader accompanying valuable goods? We cannot know for certain, but the evidence suggests a life of mobility and connection that challenges our assumptions about Bronze Age society. The Skridstrup woman, discovered in 1935 in another Danish burial mound, offers a complementary portrait of elite female life in the Nordic Bronze Age. Like the Egtved girl, she was buried in an oak coffin that preserved her remains and grave goods in remarkable condition. She was older than the Egtved girl, probably in her late teens or early 20s, and was dressed in more elaborate clothing. Her long woolen dress, reaching to her ankles, was secured at the shoulders by 2 large bronze fibulae. Her hair, dark and elaborately styled, was held in place by a fine hairnet and topped with a golden diadem. The Skridstrup woman's burial goods suggest a person of high status and refined taste. Her jewelry included not only the bronze fibulae and gold diadem, but also gold earrings and a bronze belt plate decorated with intricate spiral patterns. A horn comb and a small bronze knife, similar to those found with the Egtved girl, completed her personal equipment. The care taken in her burial, the quality of her grave goods, and the labor invested in her burial mound all point to a young woman of considerable importance in her community. Male burials of the Nordic Bronze Age elite present a different but equally revealing picture. The men were typically buried with weapons, swords, axes, spears, that marked their status as warriors. They wore elaborate bronze ornaments, including belt plates, arm rings, and fibulae, that displayed their wealth and rank. Some were buried with razors and tweezers, suggesting attention to personal grooming that we might not expect from ancient warriors. Others were accompanied by drinking vessels and food offerings, provisions for the journey to the afterlife. The Borum Eshoj burial, discovered in 1871, contained the remains of 3 individuals: an elderly man, a younger man, and a woman. All 3 were buried in oak coffins within the same mound, suggesting that they were members of the same family, perhaps spanning 3 generations. The elderly man was buried with a sword, a bronze dagger, a wooden bowl, and a folding stool, the latter a symbol of authority found in several elite male burials. The younger man had similar equipment, while the woman was buried with bronze jewelry and personal items comparable to those of the Egtved girl and Skridstrup woman. The burial practices of the Nordic Bronze Age were not static, but evolved over time. In the earlier part of the period, inhumation, the burial of the intact body, was the dominant practice. The deceased was typically placed in a wooden coffin, often made from a hollowed-out oak log, and buried beneath a mound of earth and stone. Grave goods accompanied the body, their quantity and quality reflecting the social status of the deceased. This practice produced the remarkably preserved burials that have yielded so much information about Bronze Age life. Around 1100 BCE, however, burial practices began to change. Cremation gradually replaced inhumation as the dominant funerary rite. The body was burned on a pyre, and the cremated remains were collected and placed in a ceramic urn or a small pit. The urns were then buried, sometimes beneath small mounds but often in flat cemeteries with no visible surface markers. Grave goods continued to accompany the dead, but they were typically burned along with the body, leaving only fragments and melted lumps of bronze. The shift from inhumation to cremation represents a profound change in beliefs about death and the afterlife. Inhumation preserves the body, maintaining its physical integrity for whatever existence awaits beyond death. Cremation destroys the body, releasing the spirit from its physical form. The 2 practices imply fundamentally different conceptions of the relationship between body and soul, between this world and the next. What caused this shift in belief? Was it the influence of new religious ideas spreading from the south, an internal evolution of Nordic religious thought, a response to changing social or environmental conditions? The answers remain uncertain. The grave goods buried with the dead offer insights into what the living believe the dead would need in the afterlife. Weapons suggest a continued existence as a warrior, perhaps in a celestial hall where heroes feasted and fought for eternity. Jewelry and fine clothing suggest concern for appearance and status even after death. Food and drink offerings suggest that the dead would continue to need sustenance. Personal items like combs, razors, and sewing kits suggest that the routines of daily life would continue in some form. The afterlife imagined by the people of the Nordic Bronze Age was not a realm of pure spirit, but a continuation of earthly existence, with all its needs and pleasures. Some burials contain objects that seem to have purely ritual or symbolic significance. Small clay figurines, miniature bronze weapons, and enigmatic objects of unknown purpose appear in graves throughout the Nordic Bronze Age. These items may have served as substitutes for full-sized objects, symbolic representations that would become real in the afterlife, or they may have had magical properties, protecting the dead on their journey to the next world, or ensuring their favorable reception when they arrived. The precise meaning of these objects is lost to us, but their presence reminds us that Bronze Age burial was a complex ritual act laden with symbolic significance. The treatment of the dead also reveals the social hierarchies of the living. The great burial mounds, with their elaborate chambers and rich grave goods, were reserved for a tiny elite. the vast majority of the population was buried with far less ceremony, in simple graves, with few or no accompanying objects. Some individuals received no formal burial at all, their remains disposed of in ways that left no archaeological trace. This differential treatment in death reflected and reinforced the inequalities of life, marking some individuals as worthy of remembrance, while consigning others to oblivion. Yet even the humblest graves can tell us something about the people who dug them. The care taken in positioning the body, the inclusion of even a single small object, the choice of burial location, all these details reflect the beliefs and emotions of the mourners. A mother burying her child, a wife burying her husband, a community burying one of its members. These were moments of grief and loss that transcended social rank. The dead of the Nordic Bronze Age, whether elite or common, were mourned by those who loved them, and that simple human truth connects us to them across the vast gulf of time. The religious life of the Nordic Bronze Age was rich, complex, and deeply intertwined with every aspect of daily existence. The people of this era lived in a world animated by supernatural forces, where gods and spirits inhabited the landscape, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were permeable, and where human actions could influence cosmic events. Understanding their religion is essential to understanding their society. Yet it is also one of the most challenging aspects of Bronze Age life to reconstruct. The sun occupied a central place in Nordic Bronze Age religion, as evidenced by the ubiquitous solar symbolism found on artifacts throughout the region. The Trundholm sun chariot, discovered in a Danish bog in 1902, provides the most dramatic representation of solar worship. This remarkable object consists of a bronze horse pulling a large bronze disc, one side covered with gold leaf, mounted on 6 wheels. The gold-covered side of the disc, representing the sun, faces right, the direction of the sun's daytime journey across the sky. The plain bronze side faces left, representing the sun's nighttime journey through the underworld. The sun chariot encapsulates a complex cosmological belief system in which the sun was imagined as traveling across the sky during the day, pulled by a divine horse, and then returning through the underworld at night to begin its journey anew each morning. This cyclical journey of the sun was not merely an astronomical observation, but a religious drama of cosmic significance. The sun's daily death and rebirth mirrored the cycles of nature, the alternation of day and night, the progression of the seasons, the eternal rhythm of life, death, and renewal. Solar symbolism pervades Nordic Bronze Age art. Circles, wheels, and spirals, all potentially representing the sun, appear on virtually every type of artifact. Ships, which may have been imagined as carrying the sun across the sky or through the underworld, are another common motif. The combination of sun and ship imagery is particularly frequent, suggesting a close conceptual connection between these two elements. Some scholars have proposed that the sun was believed to travel by ship during part of its journey, perhaps across the waters of the underworld or the celestial ocean of the sky. The rock carvings of Scandinavia provide additional evidence for Bronze Age religious beliefs. These carvings, found at hundreds of sites throughout Sweden and Norway, depict a rich array of images, ships, humans, animals, weapons, circular symbols, and enigmatic abstract designs. The carvings were clearly not random graffiti, but carefully planned compositions created over generations at sites of special significance. Many carving sites are located near water, by the sea, beside lakes, or along rivers, suggesting a connection between the carvings and beliefs about water and its supernatural properties. Ships are by far the most common motif in the rock carvings, appearing in virtually every major carving site. These are not realistic depictions of actual vessels, but stylized representations that emphasize certain features while ignoring others. The ships typically have high curved prows and sterns, often terminating in animal heads. They are shown carrying crews of varying sizes, from a handful of figures to dozens. Some ships appear to be in motion, their crews rowing in unison. Others seem to be stationary, perhaps engaged in some ritual activity. The prominence of ships in Bronze Age religious imagery suggests that they held deep symbolic significance beyond their practical function as transportation. Ships may have been associated with a journey to the afterlife, carrying the souls of the dead to their final destination. They may have been connected to the sun's journey across the sky, serving as the vehicle for the solar deity. They may have represented the community itself, with the crew standing for the members of society working together toward a common goal. All these interpretations, and others, have been proposed by scholars, and the truth may encompass elements of each. Human figures in the rock carvings often appear in poses that suggest ritual activity. Some figures hold weapons aloft, perhaps in gestures of worship or triumph. Others appear to be dancing or processing in groups. Still others are shown in what appear to be sexual acts, possibly representing fertility rituals. Many figures are depicted with exaggerated phalluses, emphasizing male sexuality and its association with fertility and power. Female figures are less common but do appear, sometimes in contexts that suggest they held important ritual roles. The rock carvings also depict scenes that may represent specific myths or ritual narratives. One common scene shows a large figure, often interpreted as a deity, standing in or near a ship and holding objects that may be weapons or ritual implements. Another recurring image shows two figures engaged in what appears to be combat or ritual contest. A third common motif depicts figures plowing with oxen, possibly representing agricultural rituals intended to ensure good harvests. These scenes hint at a rich mythology that was never written down and is now largely lost to us. Water played a crucial role in Nordic Bronze Age religion, as evidenced by the many valuable objects deposited in lakes, rivers, and bogs throughout the region. These deposits, often called votive offerings, include some of the finest bronze work of the period: swords, axes, jewelry, musical instruments, and other precious objects. The deliberate destruction and deposition of such valuable items suggests that they were offerings to supernatural beings believed to inhabit the watery depths. The practice of water deposition was widespread and long-lasting, continuing from the Bronze Age through the Iron Age and into the early medieval period. The famous bog bodies of Denmark and northern Germany, preserved by the acidic, anaerobic conditions of peat bogs, represent the most dramatic form of water offering, human sacrifice. While most bog bodies date to the Iron Age, the practice of depositing valuable objects in water was well established by the Bronze Age, and some human remains from this period have been found in watery contexts. The lures, those magnificent bronze horns that are among the most iconic artifacts of the Nordic Bronze Age, were almost always found in pairs deposited in bogs or other wet locations. This pattern of deposition suggests that the lures were not simply musical instruments, but sacred objects with ritual significance. Their deep, resonant tones may have been believed to communicate with the gods or to accompany important ceremonies. The fact that they were deposited in pairs, often carefully placed side by side, suggests a deliberate ritual act rather than accidental loss. Sacred sites in the Nordic Bronze Age took many forms. Some were natural features, springs, groves, prominent rocks, or unusual landforms that were believed to be inhabited by supernatural beings or to serve as portals to other worlds. Others were constructed monuments, stone circles, burial mounds, and the rock carving sites themselves. Still others may have been temporary locations, places where rituals were performed on specific occasions, and then abandoned until the next ceremony. The burial mounds of the elite served not only as tombs, but as sacred sites where the living could commune with the honored dead. The mounds were often located on prominent hilltops or ridgelines, visible from great distances and serving as landmarks in the landscape. Their visibility was surely intentional, a constant reminder of the power and prestige of the families who built them. But the mounds may also have been sites of ongoing ritual activity, places where descendants gathered to honor their ancestors and seek their guidance. Seasonal festivals likely marked the major turning points of the agricultural and astronomical year. The summer and winter solstices, when the sun reached its highest and lowest points in the sky, were probably occasions for major celebrations. The spring and autumn equinoxes, when day and night were equal in length, may also have been marked by rituals. Planting and harvest times, the movement of livestock to summer and winter pastures, the beginning and end of the sailing season. All these transitions in the annual cycle may have been accompanied by ceremonies intended to ensure success and avert disaster. The religious specialists who presided over these rituals remain shadowy figures. There is no clear evidence for a formal priesthood in the Nordic Bronze Age, but someone must have possessed the knowledge and authority to conduct ceremonies, interpret omens, and communicate with the supernatural world. These individuals may have been chiefs who combined political and religious authority, or they may have been specialists who devoted themselves entirely to sacred matters. Some scholars have suggested that women played important roles in Bronze Age religion, pointing to the elaborate burials of females like the Igdid girl and the Skridstrup woman as evidence of their high status. The religious beliefs of the Nordic Bronze Age did not exist in isolation, but were part of a broader European tradition, with roots stretching back to the Neolithic period and forward to the historical religions of the Iron Age and medieval period. Some elements of Bronze Age religion may have survived, transformed and reinterpreted in the Norse mythology recorded in medieval texts. The sun worship of the Bronze Age may be reflected in the Norse goddess Sol, who drove the chariot of the sun across the sky. The water offerings may be connected to later beliefs about sacred springs and the supernatural beings who inhabited them. The ship symbolism may have evolved into the Viking practice of ship burial and the belief that the dead traveled by ship to the afterlife. Yet we must be cautious about drawing too direct a line between Bronze Age religion and later Norse mythology. More than 1,000 years separate the end of the Bronze Age from the recording of the Norse myths, and much changed in the intervening centuries. The religion of the Bronze Age was shaped by its own unique circumstances, the importance of bronze, the patterns of long-distance trade, the specific social and political structures of the period, and cannot simply be read as an early version of later beliefs. The religious world of the Nordic Bronze Age was its own creation, a response to the needs and experiences of the people who lived it. The Nordic Bronze Age was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a vast network of connections that linked the peoples of Europe and beyond. The bronze that gave the age its name could only be produced by combining copper and tin from distant sources, and the trade routes that carried these metals also carried ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and perhaps people themselves. Understanding the Nordic Bronze Age requires understanding its place in this wider world of Bronze Age Europe and the Mediterranean. The most essential connection was the supply of metal. Copper came primarily from the Alps, where rich deposits in what is now Austria provided much of the raw material for Central and Northern European bronze production. Additional copper came from sources in the British Isles, the Iberian Peninsula, and the Carpathian Mountains. Tin, the rarer and more valuable component of bronze, came mainly from Cornwall in southwestern Britain, and from deposits in the Erzgebirge Mountains. These distant sources were connected to Scandinavia through complex trade networks that spanned the continent. The amber trade provided the primary link between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean world. Baltic amber, prized for its golden color and mysterious properties, was in high demand throughout the ancient world. It traveled south along routes that crossed Central Europe, reaching the Adriatic coast and from there the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean. In exchange, goods from the south traveled north: bronze, gold, glass beads, and perhaps more perishable items that have left no archaeological trace. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece, which flourished from roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, was one of the major consumers of Baltic amber. Mycenaean tombs have yielded amber beads and ornaments that chemical analysis has confirmed came from the Baltic region. The Mycenaeans were also major producers of bronze goods, and some scholars have suggested that Mycenaean metalwork influenced Nordic Bronze Age styles. The spiral decoration that is so characteristic of Nordic bronzes, for example, has parallels in Mycenaean art, though the direction of influence, if any, remains debated. The connections between Scandinavia and the Mediterranean were not limited to trade goods. Ideas and technologies also traveled along these routes. The practice of cremation, which gradually replaced inhumation in the Nordic Bronze Age, may have spread from the south, where it was already common in the Urnfield cultures of Central Europe. Certain weapon types, particularly swords, show clear connections between Nordic and Central European traditions, suggesting the movement of either objects or the knowledge of how to make them. Even religious ideas may have traveled these routes, though such intangible influences are difficult to trace archaeologically. The Nordic Bronze Age also had extensive connections with its immediate neighbors. To the east, the Baltic region was home to cultures that shared many features with Scandinavia, while maintaining their own distinctive traditions. The amber-rich coasts of what is now Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were important sources of this precious material, and the peoples of these regions participated in the same trade networks that connected Scandinavia to the wider world. Archaeological evidence suggests regular contact between Scandinavian and Baltic communities, including the exchange of goods, ideas, and possibly marriage partners. To the south, the cultures of northern Germany and the Netherlands formed a transitional zone between the Nordic world and Central Europe. These regions shared many cultural features with Scandinavia, including similar burial practices, artifact types, and artistic styles. Some scholars have argued that the entire region from southern Scandinavia to the Netherlands should be considered a single cultural zone, united by common traditions and regular interaction. Others emphasize the differences between sub-regions, seeing the Nordic Bronze Age as a distinct phenomenon with its own unique characteristics. To the west, the British Isles maintained connections with Scandinavia throughout the Bronze Age. The tin of Cornwall was essential to bronze production throughout Europe, and the trade routes that carried this metal also facilitated other exchanges. British and Irish bronze types show some similarities to Nordic forms, and occasional finds of distinctively British objects in Scandinavia, and vice versa, attest to direct contact between these regions. The sea that separated Britain from the continent was not a barrier but a highway, connecting coastal communities in a maritime network that spanned the North Sea and the English Channel. The nature of these long-distance connections has been much debated by scholars. Some have envisioned organized trade expeditions with merchants traveling hundreds of kilometers to exchange goods at established trading centers. Others have proposed a model of down-the-line exchange, in which goods passed from community to community, each transaction covering only a short distance, but the cumulative effect moving objects across vast distances. Still others have emphasized the role of gift exchange between elites, with valuable objects circulating as tokens of alliance and friendship, rather than as commercial commodities. The truth probably involves elements of all these models. Different types of goods may have moved through different mechanisms. Bulk commodities like copper and tin may have been transported by specialized traders who made long-distance journeys. Prestige goods like fine bronzes and gold ornaments may have circulated through elite gift exchange networks. Everyday items may have passed from hand to hand through local trade and barter. The Bronze Age economy was not a single system, but a complex web of overlapping exchange mechanisms. The people who facilitated these exchanges, the traders, merchants, and intermediaries who moved goods across vast distances, remain largely invisible in the archaeological record. We can trace the movement of objects, but rarely the individuals who carried them. Occasionally, however, we catch glimpses of these mobile individuals. The Egtved girl, with her isotopic signature indicating travel between Denmark and southern Germany, may have been one such person, though whether she traveled as a trader, a diplomat, a bride, or something else entirely remains unknown. The connections of the Nordic Bronze Age extended beyond Europe to the wider world of the ancient Near East and Egypt. While direct contact between Scandinavia and these distant civilizations was probably rare or non-existent, indirect connections through intermediate regions meant that influences could travel vast distances. The glass beads found in some Nordic Bronze Age graves, for example, were probably manufactured in Egypt or the Near East and reached Scandinavia through multiple stages of exchange. The very concept of bronze metallurgy had originated in the Near East thousands of years earlier and spread gradually across Europe, eventually reaching Scandinavia. The Nordic Bronze Age was thus part of a vast interconnected world that stretched from the Baltic to the Mediterranean and beyond. The people of Scandinavia were not isolated barbarians on the fringes of civilization, but active participants in networks of exchange that linked them to the great cultures of the ancient world. They received goods and ideas from distant lands and contributed their own products, amber, furs, and perhaps slaves, to the flow of trade. Their society was shaped by these connections, and their history cannot be understood apart from them. Yet the Nordic Bronze Age also maintained its own distinctive identity within this wider world. The people of Scandinavia adapted foreign influences to their own needs and tastes, creating a unique cultural synthesis that was neither purely local nor simply derivative of Southern models. The spiral-decorated bronzes, the great burial mounds, the rock carvings, the lures, all these were distinctively Nordic creations that had no exact parallels elsewhere. The Nordic Bronze Age was both connected to and distinct from the wider Bronze Age world, a regional variant of a pan-European phenomenon that nevertheless possessed its own unique character. Beyond the elite burials and spectacular artifacts that dominate museum displays, the Nordic Bronze Age was home to thousands of ordinary people whose lives left fewer traces in the archaeological record. These farmers, herders, craftsmen, and laborers formed the foundation of Bronze Age society, producing the food and goods that sustained the elite and enabled the creation of the magnificent objects we admire today. Understanding their daily lives is essential to understanding the Bronze Age as a whole. The basic unit of Nordic Bronze Age society was the household, a group of related individuals who lived together, worked together, and shared resources. Households varied in size from nuclear families of parents and children to extended families spanning multiple generations. Some households may have included non-relatives as well, servants, slaves, or dependents who worked for the household in exchange for food and shelter. The household was both an economic unit, organizing production and consumption, and a social unit, providing identity and belonging to its members. Households were grouped into larger communities that shared territory, resources, and social bonds. These communities, which we might call villages or hamlets, typically consisted of a handful of households, perhaps 5 to 20, living in close proximity. The members of a community cooperated in tasks that required collective labor, clearing land, building houses, herding livestock, and defending against threats. They also shared social and ritual life, gathering for festivals, ceremonies, and the resolution of disputes. The houses of the Nordic Bronze Age were substantial structures designed to shelter both humans and animals through the harsh northern winters. The typical house was a longhouse, an elongated rectangular building with a wooden frame, walls of wattle and daub or turf, and a thatched roof. The interior was divided into sections for different purposes: living quarters for the human inhabitants at one end, stalls for livestock at the other, and storage areas in between. A central hearth provided heat and light, its smoke escaping through a hole in the roof or filtering through the thatch. Life within the longhouse followed the rhythms of the seasons. In winter, when the days were short and the weather harsh, the household spent much of its time indoors. The women spun thread and wove cloth. The men repaired tools and equipment, and everyone gathered around the hearth for warmth and companionship. Stories were told, songs were sung, and the bonds of family and community were reinforced through shared experience. The livestock, housed at the other end of the building, provided additional warmth and a constant reminder of the agricultural foundation of Bronze Age life. In summer, life moved outdoors. The fields required constant attention: plowing, planting, weeding, and eventually harvesting. The livestock were driven to distant pastures, requiring some household members to spend weeks or months away from home. Fishing, hunting, and gathering supplemented the agricultural diet. Trade expeditions departed for distant markets, and visitors arrived from other communities. The long days of the northern summer were filled with activity, as the household worked to produce the surplus that would sustain it through the coming winter. The diet of Nordic Bronze Age people was varied and nutritious, based on the products of their mixed farming economy. Cereals, wheat, barley, and millet, provided the staple carbohydrates, consumed as porridge, bread, and beer. Meat came from domestic animals: cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and from hunting, deer, wild boar, and smaller game. Fish and shellfish were important in coastal areas, while inland communities relied more heavily on freshwater fish and terrestrial animals. Dairy products, milk, cheese, and butter, added protein and fat to the diet. Wild plants, including berries, nuts, and herbs, provided vitamins and variety. The preparation of food was primarily women's work, as it has been in most agricultural societies. Women ground grain into flour using stone querns, a laborious task that occupied hours each day. They tended the hearth fire, cooking porridge and stews in ceramic pots and baking bread on flat stones. They processed milk into cheese and butter, preserved meat by smoking and salting, and brewed beer from malted grain. These tasks required skill and knowledge passed down from mother to daughter over generations. Clothing in the Nordic Bronze Age was made primarily from wool, the product of the carefully managed sheep flocks that were central to the pastoral economy. The production of cloth was a complex, multi-stage process that occupied much of women's time. First, the wool had to be sheared from the sheep, cleaned of dirt and lanolin, and carded to align the fibers. Then it was spun into thread using a spindle and whorl, a simple but effective technology that converted loose fibers into continuous yarn. Finally, the thread was woven into cloth on a loom, a process that required both skill and patience. The clothing produced by Nordic Bronze Age weavers was far from primitive. The preserved garments from elite burials reveal sophisticated techniques and aesthetic sensibilities. Fabrics were woven in various weights and textures, from coarse, durable work clothes to fine, soft garments for special occasions. Colors were achieved through natural dyes derived from plants and minerals: blue from woad, red from madder, yellow from weld, and various shades of brown from bark and nuts. patterns were created through variations in weave structure and the combination of different colored threads. Men's clothing typically consisted of a tunic or shirt, trousers or a wrapped garment for the lower body, and a cloak for warmth. The tunic was usually knee-length, belted at the waist, and might be decorated with embroidery or applied ornaments. Trousers, when worn, were relatively close-fitting and might be wrapped with leather or cloth bindings below the knee. The cloak was a large rectangular piece of cloth that could be wrapped around the body in various ways and fastened with a pin or brooch. Women's clothing showed more variation, ranging from the short corded skirt of the Igitivad girl to the long dress of the Skridstrup woman. The corded skirt, made of wool cords hanging from a woven waistband, was probably summer wear, allowing air circulation in warm weather. The long dress, reaching to the ankles and fastened at the shoulders with brooches, was more suitable for cooler weather. Both types of garment might be worn with a short blouse or bodice covering the upper body. Cloaks and shawls provided additional warmth when needed. Personal ornaments were important markers of identity and status in Nordic Bronze Age society. Both men and women wore jewelry, though the types differed somewhat between the sexes. Women typically wore fibulae, brooches, to fasten their clothing, along with necklaces, bracelets, and rings. Men wore belt plates, arm rings, and sometimes neck rings. The quality and quantity of jewelry reflected social status. The elite wore elaborate pieces of bronze and gold, while commoners made do with simpler ornaments or none at all. The social structure of Nordic Bronze Age society was hierarchical, with a small elite at the top and a large population of commoners below. The elite controlled access to bronze, the most valuable commodity of the age, and used this control to maintain their power and prestige. They lived in larger houses, ate better food, wore finer clothes, and were buried with richer grave goods than the common people. Their authority was reinforced by military power, religious sanction, and the web of obligations that bound followers to leaders. Below the elite were various ranks of free commoners: farmers who worked their own land, craftsmen who produced goods for trade, and warriors who fought in the service of chiefs. These individuals enjoyed some measure of independence and prosperity, though they were subordinate to the elite and obligated to provide tribute, labor, and military service. Their graves, while less elaborate than those of the elite, often contained some bronze objects and other goods, indicating a modest level of wealth. At the bottom of the social hierarchy were those who had little or no independence: servants, slaves, and other dependents who worked for others in exchange for subsistence. The existence of slavery in the Nordic Bronze Age is difficult to prove directly, but it was common in other Bronze Age societies, and there is no reason to think Scandinavia was different. Slaves may have been war captives, debtors who had lost their freedom, or the descendants of earlier slaves. Their labor contributed to the wealth of their masters, but they themselves owned nothing and had no rights. The relationships between these social ranks were governed by a complex web of obligations and expectations. The elite were expected to be generous to their followers, providing gifts, feasts, and protection in exchange for loyalty and service. Followers were expected to support their leaders, providing labor, tribute, and military service when called upon. These relationships were personal and reciprocal, binding individuals together in networks of mutual obligation that formed the fabric of Bronze Age society. Nothing lasts forever, and the Nordic Bronze Age was no exception. After nearly 1,000 years of flourishing, the bronze-based civilization of Scandinavia began to decline around 500 BCE, eventually giving way to a new age characterized by a different metal, iron. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual transformation that unfolded over several centuries, reshaping every aspect of Nordic society. The causes of this transformation were multiple and interconnected. Climate change played a significant role, as the relatively warm and dry conditions of the Bronze Age gave way to cooler, wetter weather. This climatic deterioration, which began around 850 BCE and intensified over the following centuries, had profound effects on agriculture. Crop yields declined, pastures became waterlogged, and the agricultural surplus that had supported Bronze Age complexity diminished. Communities that had prospered during the warm centuries now struggled to survive. The disruption of long-distance trade networks was equally important. The Bronze Age had depended on the flow of copper and tin from distant sources, and when these trade routes were disrupted, the supply of bronze dried up. The causes of this disruption were complex and varied by region. In the eastern Mediterranean, the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BCE sent shockwaves through the trade networks that had connected Greece to the rest of Europe. In Central Europe, population movements and political upheavals disrupted the overland routes that had carried metal northward. As bronze became scarcer and more expensive, people began to look for alternatives. Iron, which had been known for centuries but rarely used, offered a solution. Iron ore was far more abundant than copper or tin, available in local deposits throughout Scandinavia rather than requiring long-distance trade. The technology of iron smelting was more demanding than bronze casting, requiring higher temperatures and more sophisticated furnace designs. But once mastered, it allowed communities to produce metal tools and weapons without depending on distant suppliers. The transition to iron was gradual and uneven. Bronze continued to be used for centuries after iron was introduced, particularly for ornaments and prestige goods, where its golden color and ease of casting were advantages. Iron was initially used primarily for utilitarian objects, knives, axes, and agricultural tools, where its hardness and durability outweighed its less attractive appearance. Only gradually did iron replace bronze across the full range of metal objects. The social and political consequences of this transition were profound. The elite of the Bronze Age had based their power largely on control of bronze, monopolizing access to this valuable material and using it to reward followers and display status. When bronze became scarce and iron became available to anyone who could master the smelting technology, this basis of elite power was undermined. The old hierarchies did not disappear overnight, but they were weakened, and new forms of social organization began to emerge. The archaeological record of the transition period shows a marked decline in the elaborate material culture that had characterized the Bronze Age. The great burial mounds ceased to be built, replaced by simpler graves with fewer and less impressive goods. The production of fine bronzes declined, and the artistic traditions that had produced the spiral-decorated masterpieces of the Bronze Age faded away. Rock carving, which had flourished for centuries, came to an end. To archaeologists, it appears as if the light of civilization had dimmed. Yet this apparent decline may be partly an illusion created by changes in burial practices and material culture. The people of the early Iron Age did not disappear. They continued to farm the land, raise livestock, and maintain communities. Their lives may have been harder in some ways, as climate deterioration and economic disruption took their toll, but they adapted and survived. The skills and knowledge accumulated over centuries of Bronze Age civilization did not vanish, but were transformed and transmitted to new generations. The religious beliefs of the Bronze Age also underwent transformation during this period. The sun worship that had been so central to Bronze Age religion seems to have declined in importance, replaced or supplemented by new cults and beliefs. The practice of depositing valuable objects in water continued and even intensified, but the types of objects deposited changed. Weapons, particularly swords, became increasingly common in water deposits, suggesting a growing emphasis on warfare and martial values. The early Iron Age in Scandinavia, often called the pre-Roman Iron Age, was a time of relative obscurity compared to the Bronze Age that preceded it and the Viking Age that would follow. The archaeological record is sparser, the material culture less impressive, and the connections to the wider world less evident. Yet this period was not simply a dark age of decline but a time of transformation and adaptation, as the peoples of Scandinavia adjusted to new conditions and laid the foundations for future developments. The legacy of the Nordic Bronze Age lived on in many ways. The agricultural techniques developed during the Bronze Age continued to be practiced, modified, and improved over time. The social structures, while transformed, retained elements of Bronze Age hierarchy and organization. The religious beliefs, though changed, preserved some continuity with earlier traditions. And the memory of the Bronze Age, preserved in oral traditions that would eventually be written down as Norse mythology, continued to shape Scandinavian culture for millennia. The great burial mounds of the Bronze Age remained visible features of the landscape, monuments to a vanished age that inspired wonder and speculation. Later generations, who had forgotten the true origins of these mounds, attributed them to giants, trolls, or ancient kings of legendary power. The mounds became sites of folklore and superstition, places where treasure might be found or supernatural beings encountered. In this way, the Bronze Age continued to haunt the imagination of Scandinavia long after its material culture had crumbled to dust. The transition from Bronze Age to Iron Age was not unique to Scandinavia, but occurred throughout Europe and the Mediterranean world during the centuries around 1000 BCE. Everywhere, the old bronze-based civilizations gave way to new iron-using societies, though the timing and specific circumstances varied by region. This was one of the great transformations of human history, comparable in its impact to the earlier transition from stone to metal, or the later transition from ancient to medieval civilization. For the people who lived through this transition, it must have been a time of uncertainty and anxiety. The old certainties were crumbling, the familiar world was changing, and the future was unclear. Yet they persevered, adapting to new conditions and finding new ways to survive and thrive. Their resilience and creativity ensured that the story of Scandinavia would continue, leading eventually to the Viking Age and the medieval kingdoms that would make their mark on European history. The Nordic Bronze Age ended more than 2,500 years ago, yet its echoes continue to resonate through time, shaping our understanding of the past and our sense of cultural identity. The magnificent artifacts preserved in museums, the burial mounds that still dot the Scandinavian landscape, the rock carvings that speak to us across millennia, all these are tangible connections to a vanished world that nevertheless remains part of our heritage. The rediscovery of the Nordic Bronze Age began in the 19th century, as antiquarians and early archaeologists began to systematically study the prehistoric remains of Scandinavia. The Danish scholar Christian Jørgensen Thomsen, working in the early 1800s, developed the three-age system that divided prehistory into stone, bronze, and iron ages based on the dominant material used for tools and weapons. This classification, still used today, provided a framework for understanding the long sweep of human history before written records. The excavation of Bronze Age burial mounds yielded spectacular finds that captured public imagination and established the Nordic Bronze Age as a subject of serious scholarly study. The discovery of the Trundholm Sun Chariot in 1902, the excavation of the Egtved girl's grave in 1921, and numerous other finds revealed a civilization of unexpected sophistication and artistic achievement. These discoveries challenged prevailing assumptions about prehistoric barbarians and demonstrated that complex, creative societies had flourished in Northern Europe long before the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. The study of the Nordic Bronze Age has continued to advance through the 20th and 21st centuries, as new methods and technologies have opened new windows onto the past. Radiocarbon dating, developed in the mid-20th century, allowed precise dating of organic materials, establishing firm chronologies for Bronze Age sites and artifacts. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, provided even more precise dates for wooden objects and structures. Isotope analysis revealed information about diet, mobility, and geographic origins that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of scholars. DNA analysis, the most recent addition to the archaeologist's toolkit, has revolutionized our understanding of Bronze Age populations. Studies of ancient DNA extracted from skeletal remains have revealed patterns of migration, intermarriage, and genetic change that were previously invisible. We now know that the Bronze Age was a time of significant population movement, with people traveling vast distances and mixing with local populations. The genetic heritage of modern Scandinavians includes contributions from Bronze Age migrants as well as earlier inhabitants. The Nordic Bronze Age has also become an important element of cultural identity for modern Scandinavians. The artifacts of this period, the lures, the sun chariot, the spiral-decorated bronzes, have become national symbols, reproduced on stamps, coins, and official emblems. Museums dedicated to Bronze Age finds attract hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, connecting modern people with their ancient heritage. The Bronze Age has become part of the story that Scandinavians tell about themselves, a source of pride in a deep and distinguished past. This cultural significance has sometimes led to problematic appropriations of Bronze Age symbolism. During the 20th century, nationalist and racist ideologies sought to claim the Nordic Bronze Age as evidence of ancient Aryan or Nordic superiority. The Nazis, in particular, promoted a distorted version of Nordic prehistory that served their ideological agenda. These misuses of the past remind us that archaeology is never politically neutral, and that the interpretation of ancient remains is always shaped by contemporary concerns. Modern scholarship has firmly rejected these racist appropriations, emphasizing instead the connections between the Nordic Bronze Age and the wider world. Far from being an isolated pure culture, the Nordic Bronze Age was deeply interconnected with other regions through trade, migration, and cultural exchange. The bronze that gave the age its name came from distant sources, and the ideas and technologies that shaped Nordic society had diverse origins. The Nordic Bronze Age was a regional variant of a pan-European phenomenon, not a unique creation of a superior race. The study of the Nordic Bronze Age also offers lessons for the present. The climate changes that contributed to the end of the Bronze Age remind us that human societies are vulnerable to environmental shifts beyond their control. The collapse of long-distance trade networks shows how interconnected economies can be disrupted by events in distant regions. The social transformations that accompanied the transition to iron demonstrate that technological change can have profound and unpredictable consequences. These lessons from the past have obvious relevance to our own time of climate change, globalization, and technological disruption. Perhaps most importantly, the Nordic Bronze Age reminds us of the creativity and resilience of human beings. The people of this era faced challenges that would seem insurmountable to us: harsh climates, limited technology, constant threats from disease and violence. Yet they not only survived, but created a civilization of remarkable achievement. They developed sophisticated agricultural systems, mastered complex metallurgical techniques, created art of enduring beauty, and built social structures that sustained their communities for centuries. Their accomplishments testify to the human capacity for innovation and adaptation. The voices of the Nordic Bronze Age have been silent for millennia, yet they still speak to us through the objects they made and the traces they left in the earth. The Igtived girl, forever young in her oak coffin, tells us of a world where a teenage girl could travel hundreds of kilometers and be buried with honors befitting a princess. The smith who cast the Trundholm sun chariot tells us of a world where art and religion were inseparable, where the journey of the sun across the sky was a sacred drama enacted in bronze and gold. The farmers who cleared the forests and tilled the fields tell us of a world where human labor transformed the landscape and created the foundation for all that followed. These voices from the past deserve to be heard. They remind us that we are not the first to face challenges, not the first to create beauty, not the first to seek meaning in a mysterious universe. They connect us to a human story that stretches back thousands of years and will continue long after we are gone. The Nordic Bronze Age is not just a chapter in a history book, but a living heritage that belongs to all of us, a testament to what human beings can achieve and a reminder of how much we still have to learn. As we stand before the display cases in museums, gazing at the golden spirals and gleaming bronzes of a vanished age, we are connected across time to the hands that made them and the minds that conceived them. The distance of 3,000 years collapses, and for a moment we share something with those ancient people, a sense of wonder at the beauty of crafted objects, a curiosity about the world and our place in it, a hope that something of ourselves might survive the passage of time. In that moment of connection, the Nordic Bronze Age lives again.